Let us travel together to Florence, September 1434, when Cosimo de' Medici was returning from exile. The Porta al Prato stands open on the morning of 27 September 1434, its stone archway framing a rider who has not passed beneath it in many months. You are standing among the crowd that gathers where the road from Bologna enters Florence, the September heat rising from cobblestones that have already softened in the early warmth, and the smell of horse, sweat, and dust hangs in the air as Cosimo de' Medici, 60 years old and richest citizen of the Republic, slows his mount to a walk. Around you, the merchants and laborers remove their caps, though whether from respect or caution you cannot yet tell, and the rider's face reveals nothing of the exile he has endured since the preceding autumn, when the Albizzi faction and their allies among the city's leading families drove him from this same gate with threats against his life and confiscation of his property. The family was bourgeois, not noble, for the prefix de' Medici indicates family membership rather than aristocratic title, and this distinction matters in a republic whose tradition has always been anti-autocratic, where the great families of the prior generation had governed through rapid rotation of offices and careful balance among themselves. Cosimo inherited the Medici Bank, founded by his father Giovanni di Bixi de' Medici, and that inheritance helped keep him influential in exile, his name known in the counting houses of Rome and Venice and London, the papal accounts and wool trade profits flowing through ledgers that bore his signature. You watch him dismount now, his boots finding familiar purchase on these stones, and the September heat rising from cobblestones seems to shimmer around him as he accepts a cup of water from a steward who has emerged from the nearby houses. Bell bronze clangs from the San Giovanni campanile, irregular and loud, announcing the hour to a city that already knows something has shifted in its foundations. Cosimo does not look toward the sound, but rather toward the unfinished cathedral dome that looms overhead, with Brunelleschi's scaffolding visible against the pale sky, the great ribs of masonry reaching toward completion after years of controversy and doubt. You follow his gaze upward, and the wooden frameworks seem to echo the temporary structures of power that Cosimo will now begin to dismantle and rebuild in his own fashion. For he gained control of Florence in 1434, not through proclamation, but through the accumulated weight of financial resources and personal networks that no elected office could equal or constrain. He walks now toward the Via Larga, the family's modest palace by the standards of later Medici grandeur, and you find yourself moving through streets that narrow and widen without pattern, past the dense clamor of the Mercato Vecchio, where vendors cry their wares over the heads of housewives and servants, past the notarial offices where the scratch of pen on paper records loans, land purchases, political debts, in a continuous murmur of ink and parchment. The Via Larga's relative quiet envelops you as you turn from the broader thoroughfares, and here the houses stand somewhat apart, gardens visible behind walls, the air carrying less of the wood smoke from bronze foundries that drifts over the northern quarter in a haze of industry and ambition. Cosimo walks with measured pace, acknowledging those who bow or stare, and you notice that he speaks to a wool merchant by name, to a builder whose workshop supplied stone for the family's chapel, to a young notary whose father allegedly once managed papal accounts alongside Giovanni di Bixi. The palace courtyard opens before you, its colonnades casting striped shadows across the packed earth where Cosimo meets with allies, speaking quietly, distributing loans and promises with the same precision his father brought to the bank's ledgers. You stand near the fountain where water spills from a carved basin, and the cool sound mingles with voices kept low. For Cosimo always sought consensus among the ruling elite rather than acting alone, preferring the appearance of collective deliberation even when the direction of that deliberation had been established through private correspondence weeks before. The Medici Bank was one of Europe's largest by the mid-15th century, and that financial eminence translates here into something less tangible but more durable. The expectation that Cosimo's return means stability, means credit, means the resumption of building projects suspended during his absence, and the patronage of artists whose commissions depended upon his approval. A woman in black velvet, her sleeves lined with crimson silk, approaches with two servants bearing documents, and you recognize the wife of a prominent wool merchant whose family has supported the Medici faction since the conflicts of the 1420s. She speaks of her husband's imprisonment during Cosimo's exile, of the fines levied against their household, of the need for restoration that extends beyond mere political favor into the tangible repair of fortunes destroyed by the Albizzi regime. Cosimo listens, his hand resting on the fountain's rim, and you observe that he does not promise immediate action, but rather asks after her children, after the health of her mother-in-law at their villa in the hills, after the quality of this year's wool clip from their estates in the Mugello. The Medici would dominate Florentine politics and culture until 1494, though that dominance would prove more fragile than this moment suggests, and you sense already the method by which Cosimo's indirect rule through private wealth would eventually prove unstable, collapsing in the 1490s when his grandson's extravagance and misjudgment squandered what this careful builder constructed. Evening finds you riding through the northern gate, past fields where laborers bend among the vines, toward Careggi, the villa outside the city walls where Cosimo will later die on 1 August 1464, where he now retreats from the pressures of renewed public life into the relative seclusion of terraced gardens and private suppers. The evening cool at Careggi brings relief from the day's accumulated warmth, and cypress shadows lengthen across gardens where medicinal herbs grow in ordered beds, where philosophers will gather in decades to come to discuss Plato and the immortality of the soul, where Cosimo's collection of manuscripts begins, the kernel of what will become the Laurenziana, though that name belongs to a future generation. You dismount in the gravelled courtyard, and servants emerge to take your horse, to offer water for washing, to announce that supper awaits in the long room overlooking the valley toward Florence. The taste of Vernaccia wine, golden, from San Gimignano, accompanies a meal of simple preparation. Bread baked that morning, white beans dressed with oil from the family's own groves, a fowl stewed with herbs from the garden you walked through at dusk. Cosimo eats sparingly, speaking with a scholar recently returned from Constantinople who carries knowledge of Greek texts unknown in the Latin West, and you listen as they discuss the possibility of acquiring certain manuscripts, of copying others, of building a collection that will serve not merely private vanity, but the education of a city. Cosimo sponsored extensive building projects and supported arts and education on a large scale, yet here in the candlelit room with its view of the darkening valley, those ambitions wear the aspect of quiet conversation among men who share a common language of learning and faith. The scholar departs, and you find yourself alone with Cosimo on the terrace, the city below reduced to scattered lights, and the occasional sound of bell bronze clanging from San Giovanni Campanile, irregular and loud even at this distance, carrying across the intervening space like a reminder of obligations waiting for tomorrow's attention. Cosimo respected the Republican Constitution in principle, but reshaped it, and you understand now that this villa represents something essential to that reshaping, a place apart where decisions mature in private, where the appearance of Republican deliberation can be prepared before the formal mechanisms of state, are set in motion. He avoided appearing as a ruler, preferring to seem a citizen among citizens, and this villa with its modest scale, its working gardens, its absence of fortification or overt magnificence, embodies that preference in stone and cultivated earth. You return to Florence in the morning, the September heat rising from cobblestones more intense now as summer lingers into the month's final days, and the smell of horse sweat and dust accompanies your passage through streets that seem unchanged, yet somehow altered in their atmosphere, as though the air itself has become charged with new possibility. The Signoria meets as always in the Palazzo della Signoria, its chambers arranged for the deliberations of the 9 priors and the gonfaloniere of justice. But now the names proposed for offices carry Cosimo's approval, transmitted through channels that remain formally invisible, acknowledged through nods and whispered consultations rather than open direction. You stand in the gallery above the council chamber, observing the ceremony of republican governance proceeding with its ancient formulas, and you note how the prior who speaks most frequently, who proposes the motions that gather most support, who defers most gracefully to his colleagues, has debts to the Medici Bank that extend back through his father's generation to the founding partnerships of Giovanni di Bixi's earliest enterprises. Giovanni di Bixi's bank, built on papal accounts and wool trade, funds cultural transformation in ways that become visible as you walk through the city in the days following Cosimo's return. At the monastery of San Marco, work resumes on cells whose walls will bear frescoes by a young painter named Fra Angelico, commissioned through Medici intermediaries with funds whose ultimate source traces to the same papal accounts that financed the bank's original expansion. The scratch of pen on paper in notarial offices continues through the afternoon hours, and you pause in one such office to observe a document being prepared. The purchase of a vineyard estate whose produce will supply this table and others, whose acquisition extends the network of dependency and obligation that Cosimo weaves through the Florentine Contado. The family was bourgeois, not noble, and this persistent fact shapes every transaction, every alliance, every careful avoidance of title or prerogative that might provoke the republican suspicion of autocratic ambition. Wood smoke from bronze foundries drifts over the northern quarter, carrying the metallic tang of molten alloy and the labor of artisans who cast bells and sculptures, and the fittings for the architectural projects that Cosimo sponsored. You follow this smoke to workshops where masters and apprentices labor over commissions that have multiplied since his return, where the unfinished cathedral dome looms overhead, Brunelleschi's scaffolding visible in glimpses between the crowded buildings, where the ambition to complete what generations have left suspended now finds the financial backing that makes completion conceivable. Cosimo forged a lasting alliance with previously hostile Milan, and that diplomatic achievement resonates in these workshops too, for the marble that arrives from Carrara passes through territories controlled by the Visconti and their successors, and safe passage depends upon understandings reached in private correspondence between Cosimo and the Milanese court. The days accumulate into weeks, and you find yourself establishing rhythms of observation that carry you from the Via Larga's relative quiet in the morning hours, away from the dense clamor of the Mercato Vecchio, to the notarial offices and workshops, and finally to the evening cool at Careggi, where cypress shadows lengthen across terraced gardens in patterns that shift with the season's advance. Cosimo faced fierce opposition from previously leading families, and you encounter traces of that opposition in the guarded greetings of certain merchants, in the sudden silences that fall when Medici partisans enter certain taverns, in the petitions for redress that continue to reach the Signoria from those whose property was confiscated during the Albizzi dominance, and who now fear that Cosimo's return means their own displacement. Yet the opposition lacks coordination, lacks the financial resources that Cosimo commands, lacks the network of papal and foreign alliances that the Medici Bank has constructed across decades of patient accumulation. You attend a public ceremony in the cathedral, its interior still raw from the structural innovations that Brunelleschi's dome required, the spaces beneath the rising vaults echoing with the chant of clergy and the murmur of the assembled guild representatives. Cosimo stands among the crowd, his dress scarcely distinguishable from that of other wealthy merchants, and you observe how he positions himself slightly apart from the central group of dignitaries, how he defers when precedence is distributed, how he accepts with apparent reluctance the invitations to join processions or to speak at guild assemblies. His power rested on financial resources and personal networks, not elected offices, and this visible performance of modesty serves to obscure the concentration of influence that his wealth makes possible. Yet the obscurity is itself a form of power, for those who would resist must first locate what they oppose, and Cosimo's deliberate diffusion of authority through multiple intermediaries makes such location difficult. The taste of Vernaccia wine, golden from San Gimignano, returns at a supper held in the palace of a wool merchant whose family has shifted allegiance from the Albizzi to the Medici since Cosimo's return, whose hospitality now serves to demonstrate the completeness of that shift. You sit among 24 guests, the conversation circling through topics of trade and politics and the proper interpretation of certain passages in Dante, and you notice how Cosimo speaks rarely, how his interventions come at moments when disagreement threatens to become heated, how his proposed resolutions seem obvious once stated yet had eluded the more vehement participants. He always sought consensus among the ruling elite rather than acting alone, and this supper illustrates that method in its social dimension. The creation of occasions where private agreement can emerge from public interaction, where opposition can be converted into participation through the rituals of shared consumption and conversation. Bell bronze clangs from San Giovanni Campanile, irregular and loud, marking the passage of time across evenings that lengthen as autumn advances, and you find yourself increasingly drawn to the hours after sunset when the city contracts into itself, when the workshops close and the notarial offices fall silent, and the streets become channels for solitary walkers or small groups making their way between private houses. You sense the beginnings of Medici dominance in these quiet passages, in the confidence with which partisans move through spaces that once required caution, in the architectural projects that advance visibly week by week, in the manuscripts that accumulate in the rooms above the Via Larga Palace, where Cosimo's collection of manuscripts begins. The kernel of what will become the Laurenziana sits in wooden chests, catalogued by scholars who have found in his patronage the means to pursue their studies without the distractions of ecclesiastical or academic obligation. You ride again to Careggi as the season turns, the September heat rising from cobblestones, now a memory replaced by the sharper chill of October mornings, the smell of horse sweat and dust mingling with the scent of fallen leaves and the smoke of early fires. The evening cool at Careggi comes sooner now, and cypress shadows lengthen across terraced gardens in the amber light of afternoons that close rapidly into dusk. Cosimo walks with you through the gardens, speaking of his father Giovanni di Bixai, of the bank's founding in an earlier generation's more uncertain times, of the papal accounts that provided the initial capital for expansion into wool trade and foreign exchange, and the financial services that popes and cardinals required as their own affairs grew more complex. He inherited the Medici Bank from his father, and that inheritance carries obligations that extend beyond mere profit into the cultural and political transformation of a city that has never quite accepted the dominance of any single family. The villa's rooms seem to expand around you as darkness falls, their proportions generous without ostentation, their decoration learned without pedantry. You sit with Cosimo before a fire that consumes oak logs from the estate's woodlands, and the conversation turns to the manuscripts recently acquired from a monastery in Pisa, to the possibility of commissioning copies for other collectors, to the young sculptor whose work in marble has attracted attention in the workshops near the cathedral. Cosimo sponsored extensive building projects, and the firelight seems to illuminate models and drawings that lie on tables nearby, proposals for the completion of San Lorenzo, for the renovation of the family chapel, for the library that will house the growing collection. He supported arts and education on a large scale, yet here in the firelit room with its view of starlit gardens, that support wears the aspect of personal enthusiasm, of conversation among those who share a passion rather than of systematic cultural policy. You return to the city in the morning, and the wood smoke from bronze foundries drifts over the northern quarter in patterns that seem unchanged, yet somehow softer, as though the industry's energy itself has moderated with the season's turn. The unfinished cathedral dome looms overhead, Brunelleschi's scaffolding visible against a sky that has cleared after days of rain, and you pause to watch workmen ascending the steep angles of the vault, their figures small against the masonry, their movements deliberate and unhurried. The Via Larga's relative quiet receives you as you turn from the broader streets, and here you find Cosimo already in conference with builders and architects, examining samples of stone, discussing the structural problems that the dome's completion still presents. He speaks as a knowledgeable amateur, deferring to professional expertise, yet his questions probe precisely the points where finance and engineering intersect, where the availability of funds determines the pace of innovation and the willingness to attempt solutions that tradition might reject. The afternoon brings you to the notarial offices where the scratch of pen on paper continues in a rhythm that seems eternal, that connects this moment to all the moments of Florentine commerce across centuries of practice. You observe a document being prepared that records Cosimo's purchase of a substantial estate in the Mugello, the family's ancestral territory, and the notary reads back the formal language of acquisition, while Cosimo listens with apparent abstraction, his attention seemingly caught by the play of afternoon light through the high window. Yet when the notary stumbles over a boundary description, Cosimo supplies the correction without apparent thought, and you understand again how thoroughly his knowledge extends through every detail of his affairs, how the appearance of delegation and distance masks a continuous engagement with the instruments of his power. Evening finds you once more at Careggi, the evening cool now familiar as a refuge from the city's intensities, the cypress shadows lengthening across terraced gardens in patterns that you have come to anticipate, to depend upon as markers of a day properly concluded. Cosimo sits in the garden's most sheltered corner, wrapped against the autumn chill, and a servant brings the taste of Vernaxia wine, golden from San Gimignano, served at private suppers that have become your accustomed conclusion to days of observation and movement. The wine seems softer now, more yielding, as though the season's change has affected even this stable element of your experience, and you drink slowly, watching the last light fade from the western sky above the distant city. Cosimo speaks of his exile, of the months in Venice and Padua where the Medici bank's branches provided sustenance and connection, of the negotiations that preceded his return, of the conditions that his enemies attempted to impose and that he accepted only to circumvent. That experience of displacement, of threatened extinction, shapes the caution with which he now advances, the consensus he seeks, the appearance of republican virtue that he cultivates with the same attention he brings to his manuscripts and his building projects. Florence's republican tradition was traditionally anti-autocratic, and Cosimo's entire method represents an adaptation to that tradition, a discovery of how dominance might be exercised through the forms of equality, how power might accumulate through the renunciation of its overt display. The night deepens around you, and the stars emerge in configurations that seem to hold their own slow counsel above the villa and the city and the broader territories where Cosimo's influence extends. You feel the weight of the day departing, the accumulated impressions of stone and heat and smoke and wine settling into memory with the gentle insistence of experience that will not be fully processed until sleep has worked its own transformations. A servant lights additional lamps, their flames steady in the still air, and the light falls across Cosimo's features in a way that emphasizes the lines that exile and return have etched, the patience that has become indistinguishable from calculation. He became the richest citizen of Florence, and that wealth now surrounds you in the ordered gardens, the well-appointed rooms, the network of dependents and allies and cultural projects that extend his presence far beyond any single location or moment. Yet here in the lamplight, with the night sounds of the countryside replacing the city's continuous murmur, wealth itself seems to dissolve into something more elemental. The desire to build, to preserve, to shape a world that will persist beyond the builder's own participation. You rise to retire, and Cosimo's gesture of farewell acknowledges without insisting, includes without demanding, characterizes the relationship that his entire method establishes between himself and those who move within his influence. The rooms prepared for guests await you with their clean linens and their view of darkness where the gardens have been, and you find yourself standing at the window longer than you had intended, longer than the day's fatigue would seem to permit, held by some quality in the night that seems to require nothing of you, that offers itself as pure presence without obligation or consequence. The cypresses stand against the sky in shapes that you can trace without seeing, their darkness a form of knowledge that accumulates through repeated observation rather than through any single clarified perception. The September heat rising from cobblestones, the smell of horse sweat and dust, the bell bronze clanging from San Giovanni Campanile, irregular and loud, all these seem now to belong to a different order of experience, one that has completed itself and receded into the past that the night preserves without demanding your active attention. The Via Larga's relative quiet, the dense clamor of the Mercato Vecchio, the wood smoke from bronze foundries drifting over the northern quarter, the taste of Vernaxia wine, golden, from San Gimignano, the scratch of pen on paper in notarial offices, recording loans, land purchases, political debts. All these impressions have found their place in a narrative that you have not chosen yet cannot escape, the narrative of Cosimo's return, and the transformation that return initiates. You turn from the window, and the darkness of the room receives you with the softness of linen, the slight give of a mattress prepared for your rest, the gradual dissolution of conscious intention into the sleep that awaits. Somewhere in the villa, a door closes softly, a servant completes a final task, a dog settles into the shelter of a wall. The night extends around Careggi, the villa outside the city walls where Cosimo will later die, where he now sleeps in rooms not distant from your own, his dreams perhaps touching upon the same manuscripts and building projects that occupied his waking hours, perhaps wandering into regions where the distinction between public ambition and private desire loses its sharpness, where the citizen among citizens finds the solitude that even consensus cannot entirely dissolve. The last lamps flicker in corridors that lead to rooms you will not enter, and the darkness itself seems to acquire texture, to become something you might touch or taste, a medium in which the boundaries between self and world, between observer and observed, gradually loosen and float apart. You are here, and you are not here, and the distinction matters less with each passing moment of wakefulness that surrenders to the deeper rhythms of rest. Cosimo de' Medici, born 27 September 1389 in Florence, who gained control of the city in 1434, who forged a lasting alliance with previously hostile Milan. These names and dates persist in the mind's last active regions, not as facts to be recalled, but as presences that have shaped the space through which you move, the air you breathe, the sleep that now receives you with the same patience that characterized all his building, all his waiting, all his careful construction of a city that would remember him as Pater Patrii, Father of the Fatherland, though that title would come only after death, only when the work was complete and the builder could no longer be questioned about his methods or his motives. The night is very still now. The cypresses do not move. The stars maintain their ancient stations. And you, who have walked through this day of return and beginning, find the sleep that has been waiting, that has always been waiting, in the darkness that receives you like the darkness of a garden where no one walks, where the paths have grown over with grass, where the only sound is the sound of your own breathing gradually deepening, gradually slowing, gradually becoming indistinguishable from the breathing of the night itself. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, though this harbour is of stone and mortar, rising above the terracotta sea of Florence. The mist from the Arno Valley drifts between the buildings, and through that pale veil, the half-finished dome of Santa Maria del Fiore emerges like a ghost summoned by first light. Arnolfo di Cambio laid the cathedral's foundations more than a century past, and his design called for a dome so vast that no one knew how to build it. For decades, the octagonal space gaped open to the weather, a cathedral without its crown, a promise deferred from one generation to the next. The cold air moves across your face as you look upward, and the scale of what was attempted and what was abandoned settles into your chest with the weight of something that has waited longer than a single lifetime. The groan of oak hoisting machines carries from the construction site beyond the nave, rope burning against pulley-greased axles with a sound like distant thunder, slowed to a human rhythm. Filippo Brunelleschi won the competition to design this dome in 1418, and by 1436 his solution would stand complete during Cosimo's ascendancy, though Cosimo himself had only lately returned from exile when the first ceremonies began. You move through the streets where masons are already stirring, their breath visible in the November morning, their wooden clogs scraping against frost-slicked cobbles. The taste of lime and sand from mortar hangs in the narrow passages between workshops, and brick dust coats the throats of men who have not yet spoken aloud today. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of fired brick from kilns along the Arno, each piece stamped with the marks of its maker, each one destined for a position calculated by geometry that Brunelleschi guards with suspicious secrecy. You find the base of the internal scaffolding as lantern light still flickers against wet stone, and there is Brunelleschi himself, climbing the wooden stair that spirals upward into the incomplete vault. He carries no written plans, or so the stories later claim, keeping his methods in memory and model. The herringbone brick pattern he invented spreads beneath his fingers as he tests the night's work, each brick angled to transfer its load to its neighbors before the mortar has fully set. No external wooden scaffolding supports the dome during construction, unprecedented for such a span of 45.5 meters, the largest brick and masonry dome ever built. The hollow acoustic inside the unfinished vault receives every hammer blow and magnifies it, sending echoes multiplying through the octagonal space, until the sound seems to come from everywhere at once, from the future as much as from the present moment. Hot bronze from the baptistry, foundry, drifts on the south wind, sulphur and copper mingling with the sharper scent of curing mortar. The cathedral complex spreads around you in its parts. Giotto's campanile standing slender and striped beside the main body, and beyond that the baptistry of San Giovanni, consecrated in the 11th century, possibly around 1059. You walk toward it through the piazza, where the paving stones hold the cold of night, even as the eastern sky begins to warm. The baptistry is considered a central work of Florentine Romanesque, also called Proto-Renaissance, and its 8 equal sides give it the geometry of a perfect jewel set among the irregular growth of the surrounding streets. The 3 bronze portals created between 1330 and 1452 will draw you closer, though the newest one still awaits its final installation. Andrea Pisano designed the south portal, completed in 1336, and its 28 panels narrate the life of St. John the Baptist in relief, so shallow it seems to move only when the light moves. You trace the scenes with your eyes, the Annunciation to Zacharias, the birth and naming of the child, the preaching in the wilderness. The metal has darkened with age and handling, touched by generations of pilgrims who sought blessing at the threshold. Lorenzo Ghiberti's north portal was completed between 1401 and 1422, and the competition for its commission had already announced the new spirit of the age, with Brunelleschi himself among the losing entrants. The panels here grow more complex, the figures more naturally weighted, the architectural settings deeper and more convincingly spaced. You stand between these 2 doors, old and less old, and feel the pressure of time accumulating in bronze. The dome spans 5 meters, and this measurement repeats in your thoughts as you return to the cathedral works, as the mind returns to what it cannot fully comprehend. The masons' hoisting machines creak and turn, lifting bricks from the street below in loads that swing and settle, that rise past the level of the surrounding rooftops to where men wait with guiding poles. You watch from the edge of the construction platform, the city spreading beneath you like a relief map, the Arno a silver thread catching what light the mist allows through. Brunelleschi invented new hoisting machines and a herringbone brick pattern to distribute weight, and these inventions emerge from the mind of a man who studied ancient ruins, who measured the Pantheon, who understood that the Romans had solved problems his own contemporaries had forgotten. The bricks ascend in their rope harnesses, each one a small red promise kept against the enormity of the void they will fill. Afternoon light through the oculus will come later, when the dome is sealed, and the seasons turn enough to carry the sun's disk across the floor in its slow annual procession. For now you are inside the growing vault, and the light enters through temporary gaps, through the spaces between courses not yet closed, falling in angled shafts that pick out the texture of rough-set brick. The hollow acoustic inside the unfinished vault surrounds you, every footstep, every murmur of the masons, every creak of the hoisting machines returning multiplied from the curving walls. You place your palm against the herringbone pattern and feel the slight irregularities, where human hands pressed mortar into gaps, where the day's heat and the night's cold have already begun their long work of settlement and stress. The structure holds by its own weight and geometry, a principle that Brunelleschi demonstrated with his famous egg, though that story belongs to the competition of 1418, to the moment of winning rather than to this prolonged labor of proving. Dawn mist in the Arno Valley returns the next morning, and the dome, emerging ghost-like above terracotta roofs, has grown visibly higher in the hours you slept on a pallet in the mason's lodge. The cold air moves across your face with the particular freshness of autumn mornings in Tuscany, when the valley holds its moisture close and the hills beyond remain invisible. Filippo Brunelleschi climbs the scaffolding at dawn, testing his herringbone pattern by lantern light that has not yet been extinguished, a small moving glow visible from the streets below where bakers are firing their ovens and the first prayers are being murmured in monastic cells. You follow at a distance, climbing the same wooden stair, feeling it sway slightly with your weight, and with the weight of the man ahead, the rope railings rough against your palm. The groan of oak hoisting machines begins again, rope burning against pulley-greased axles with the patient regularity of a task that will continue for years yet. You look down through gaps in the planking and see the piazza reduced to a pattern of movement, human figures no longer distinct, the baptistry a small octagon among larger shapes. The baptistry was consecrated in the 11th century, possibly around 1059, and it has watched this slow ascent from the beginning, its own bronze doors witnessing the same sky, the same changes of weather, the same accumulation of human effort toward forms that outlast their makers. In the naming of that architecture as Proto-Renaissance, you hear the scholar's later recognition of something emerging, something not yet fully born in the rounded arches and compact volumes of its construction. Brick dust in masons' throats produces a particular quality of voice, hoarse and economical, as instructions pass from man to man across the growing curve of the vault. The taste of lime and sand from mortar mixes with the bread and onion of midday meals eaten sitting on stacked materials, legs dangling over edges where the drop grows longer each month. You sit among them, anonymous, accepted by presence alone, and listen to talk that ranges from the price of pozzolana to the health of distant relatives, from the behavior of the signoria to the quality of last year's wine. The dome was completed in 1436, during Cosimo's ascendancy, but in these earlier years the politics of the city shift and settle like the mortar itself, finding level through conflict and compromise. No one speaks of the future completion, as if naming it might invoke the envy of forces beyond human control. The hollow acoustic inside the unfinished vault receives a snatch of song from somewhere below, a lullaby perhaps, or a fragment of chant carried up through the octagonal space by currents of air no one can predict. Every sound echoes multiply, locating the singer nowhere and everywhere, present and already memory. You lie back on a pile of clean sand brought for the next day's mixing and watch the sky through the opening that is still construction rather than completion. Afternoon light through the oculus will come, a single disc moving across the floor as seasons turn, but for now the light is diffuse, the whole aperture glowing with overcast, with the particular grey luminosity of Tuscany before rain. Hot bronze from the baptistry foundry reaches you even here, sulphur and copper on the south wind, that carries also the rumour of weather changing, of storms held somewhere in the hills towards Siena. You descend in the evening, when the light has shifted to horizontal, when long shadows stripe the streets, and the dome casts its growing shadow across rooftops where families are gathering for the evening meal. The baptistry's 3 bronze portals draw you as they have drawn others, as they will continue to draw for centuries. Andrea Pisano designed the south portal, completed 1336, and you touch its frame where the metal has been polished by contact, where the stone beneath it has worn to a softer edge. Lorenzo Ghiberti's north portal was completed 1401 to 1422, and the transition between these two works marks the passage of generations, the slow education of taste and skill. The figures in Ghiberti's panel seem to breathe, to occupy space that continues behind them, a discovery that will transform what is possible in relief. You stand in the threshold between day and evening, between one maker and the next, and feel the accumulated weight of attention that these doors have received, the eyes that have read their stories, the hands that have pushed them open toward baptism and return. The dome spans 5 meters, the largest brick and masonry dome ever built, and this fact returns to you as you climb to your lodging, as the body remembers what the mind has registered. No external wooden scaffolding supported the dome during construction, unprecedented for such a span, and the audacity of this decision reveals itself gradually, like a landscape emerging from fog. You sleep in a room where the plaster is damp, where the smell of the river enters through shutters that do not fully close, and your dreams are of climbing, of stairs that extend beyond any destination, of vaults that curve above you without visible support. The cold air moves across your face from some source you cannot locate, and you surface from sleep to find the dark absolute, the silence broken only by breathing, by the settling of old buildings, by the distant watchman's call. Cosimo, newly returned from exile, will attend the 1436 consecration, standing among the crowd that gathers for the ceremony. But that moment lies ahead, and in the years between, the work continues through seasons of plague and plenty, through the death of workers and the birth of children who will never see the structure their fathers built. You are present at the laying of a particular course, a day chosen for fair weather, the sky visible through the open vault a pure blue that seems to promise permanence. Brunelleschi is there, older now, his beard grizzled, his movements slower but still precise, as he indicates where the next brick must sit, how the mortar must be worked into the joint. The herringbone brick pattern he invented spreads beneath your gaze like a textile, like something woven rather than constructed, each unit dependent on its neighbors, the whole stronger than any individual strength. The groan of oak hoisting machines has become so familiar that silence would seem strange, would suggest some breakdown, some interruption in the flow of materials. Rope burns against pulley-greased axles, and the men who tend these machines move with the unconscious grace of long practice, their bodies attuned to the stresses and sounds that indicate proper function. You watch a load of bricks rise past your level, swinging slightly, guided by a pole wielded by a man whose face you do not see, whose voice reaches you only as instruction without content, tone without word. Dawn mist in the Arno Valley comes again, as it will come again, as the dome emerging ghost-like above terracotta roofs grows more present, more solid, more inevitable with each passing month. The cold air moves across your face as you stand at a new height, a vantage earned by climbing, by persistence, by the simple fact of remaining when others have departed for other tasks, other cities, other lives. Filippo Brunelleschi won the competition to design the dome in 1418, and that year recedes now, becomes one of the dates that organize the narrative, that allow the story to be told in sequence even as experience refuses such ordering. You are here now, in the mist, in the growing presence of what was once impossible, and the impossibility has become merely difficult, the difficulty merely laborious, the labor merely what remains to be done before the next stage begins. The baptistry of San Giovanni waits in its place, as it has waited since its consecration in the 11th century, possibly around 1059. You walk around it in the hour before noon, when the octagonal drum catches light on its eastern faces and holds shadow on the west, the marble revetments glowing with a warmth that the day's full glare will later bleach away. Lorenzo Ghiberti's east portal, the Gates of Paradise, was completed 1425 to 1452, and even now, unfinished, its panels draw the attention of those who have access to the foundry, who can observe the slow emergence of figures from wax and clay, from the negative spaces of molds. The east portal's nickname Gates of Paradise was allegedly coined by Michelangelo, a child not yet born, a prophecy of praise from a future that cannot be known. You hear this name whispered by a man examining the unfinished gates, his finger tracing in air the composition that Ghiberti has planned, the stories from Genesis that will unfold in 10 panels of surpassing refinement. Below, in the streets, the baptistry's new east portal draws crowds even before installation. Word spreading through the quarters where artists gather, where patrons send their agents to observe and report. The hot bronze from the baptistry foundry carries its particular signature, sulphur and copper on the south wind, and you follow that scent to the workshop where the casting is done, where the risks of the process, cracks, bubbles, incomplete fills, are managed by skill and by the prayers that precede each pouring. The hollow acoustic inside the unfinished vault receives your return. You're climbing once more to the level where work continues despite the season, despite the difficulties of weather and supply. Every hammer blow echoes multiply, and you pause to let the sound complete its dying, to let the space return to the silence that is its natural condition. The last stone set will come, the final brick that completes the vault, and the interior space will open. A vast emptiness painted later with Vasari's Last Judgment, though that painting belongs to a later century, to a different understanding of what such a space should contain. For now the brick is raw, the mortar fresh, the geometry visible in a way that future decoration will obscure. You walk the octagonal perimeter at the level of the springing, where the curve begins its ascent, and feel the force that presses outward, that the herringbone pattern and the double shell are designed to contain. Workmen remove the final internal supports, and the structure holds by its own weight and geometry, the proof of Brunelleschi's calculations made manifest in survival. You are present at this removal, the wooden shores drawn away with ceremony, and with fear, the moment of testing that no calculation can fully predict. Now no internal scaffolding supports it either, unprecedented in a different way, a structure that stands by virtue of its own form, its own distribution of forces through curves that carry weight to the piers below. The men stand silent, listening, as if the stones might speak their intention to collapse, as if warning might precede disaster. But the stones are silent in their stability, their settlement so gradual as to be imperceptible. The dome completed in 1436, during Cosimo's ascendancy, holding the sky at bay. The lantern atop the dome was added later, designed by Brunelleschi, but completed after his death in 1446, a decade beyond the consecration, a coda to the main work. You see it in imagination, raised piece by piece, a beacon visible across the Tuscan hills, the light that will guide travelers by night, that will mark the city's pride from distances where the cathedral itself sinks below the horizon. The lantern, raised piece by piece, will require its own machines, its own solutions, though the principles established in the greater construction will serve for the lesser. You stand at the summit of the completed vault, where the oculus opens to weather, where rain enters and must be carried away by drains that Brunelleschi also designed, the practical imagination extending to every consequence of his grand conception. Afternoon light through the oculus moves across the floor in the season of your presence, a single disk that tracks the sun's path, that makes the interior a kind of sundial, a calendar in light and shadow. You watch this movement from a position near the eastern pier, where the nave extends toward the entrance, where the congregation will gather in the years after the consecration. Pope Eugene IV will consecrate the dome on 25 March 1436, the feast of the Annunciation, the beginning of the Florentine year, a date chosen for its resonance with new beginnings, with the impossible made possible. Cosimo, newly returned from exile, attends the 1436 consecration, standing among the crowd that fills the piazza and spills into the surrounding streets, the procession threading between the baptistry and the cathedral facade, between the old sacred center and its newest expression. The groan of oak hoisting machines has ceased by that day, replaced by the sound of bells, of voices raised in the Latin of the liturgy, of the Te Deum sung in the finished space. You are there among the crowd, the cold air of early spring moving across your face, the sky visible through the oculus a blue that seems earned, deserved by the length of labor that preceded it. The dome was consecrated by Pope Eugene IV on 25 March 1436, and this formula, this naming of actor and date and act, will be repeated in chronicles, will fix the event in the record. But your experience is of bodies pressed together, of the smell of incense and of unwashed wool, of the architectural volume that receives all this human presence and transforms it into something measured, something that can be felt as presence rather than as chaos. The baptistry of San Giovanni stands as it has stood, its 3 bronze portals complete now or nearly so, the gates of paradise in their final polishing even as the ceremony proceeds. The cathedral complex includes Giotto's campanile and the baptistry of San Giovanni, and these elements frame the experience of the Piazza, establish a sequence of approach and entry that every Florentine knows by heart. You move through this sequence after the formalities end, when the crowd disperses into smaller groups, into families and neighborhoods, into the ordinary life that will continue beneath the dome's protection. The baptistry's 3 bronze portals were created between 1330 and 1452, and this span of years, longer than most lives, marks the duration of a cultural project that no individual could have planned or witnessed entire. The dome spans 5 meters, and this measurement, repeated now in your thoughts, becomes a kind of meditation, a way of holding the magnitude of what has been accomplished. The largest brick and masonry dome ever built stands above you, and you have watched it grow from nothing, from the abandoned project of a previous century, from the competition of 1418 to the consecration of 1436 and beyond. The lantern, raised piece by piece, will complete the silhouette that you have seen in drawings, in models, in the mind's eye of those who planned before the first stone was set. A beacon visible across the Tuscan hills, it will catch the last light of evening, will be the final human-made thing visible to travelers departing westward, the first to greet those arriving from the direction of the sea. Hot bronze from the baptistry foundry has cooled now, the last castings done, the workshops turning to other commissions, other patrons, other cities that have seen what Florence can produce and desire the same for themselves. The sulfur and copper on the south wind diminish, replaced by the ordinary smells of a city that has returned to work after celebration, that must feed and clothe itself regardless of architectural glory. You walk the streets in the days following the consecration, and the dome is simply there, present in glimpses between buildings, dominant from the higher ground across the river, unnoticed, and then suddenly noticed again, as if the mind must periodically remind itself of what the eye has grown accustomed to seeing. The hollow acoustic inside the finished vault receives your footsteps now, no longer multiplied in the same way, the surfaces cured and hardened, the space settled into its final resonance. You speak aloud, experimentally, and the sound returns single, contained, the vast emptiness painted later with Vasari's Last Judgment still empty in your present, still awaiting the hand that will fill it with figures ascending and descending, with the drama of salvation rendered in pigment and plaster. The interior space opens, a vast emptiness that will become, in time, something else, but that for now holds only light, only the movement of air, only the presence of those who enter to marvel at what human persistence can construct. The cold air moves across your face as you emerge, as you step from the shadow of the portal into the piazza where evening is gathering, where the first lamps are being lit in windows that face the stones beneath your feet have held the passage of 10,000 days and more, yet they still carry the warmth of afternoon sun in their upper surfaces, still release it slowly into the cooling air of this hour. You're walking now through the outer precincts of Florence, through streets that narrow and widen without pattern, past walls where the plaster has aged to the color of old ivory, past doorways where servants pause in their evening tasks to watch the last light fade from the sky above the Arno. The villa at Careggi waits on its hillside, and you are climbing toward it, feeling the incline in your thighs, the slight shortening of breath that comes with elevation. Marsilio Ficino, born 19 October 1433 in Figline Valdarno, has made this journey countless times since Cosimo de' Medici first summoned him to translate the ancient dialogues. The path you follow is the same earth compressed by similar footsteps, the same view of Florence spreading below with its towers and its bridges becoming indistinct in the gathering dusk. Evening cool rises from the Arno Valley, a current that moves upward through terraces of olive and vine, carrying faint moisture of the river and denser sense of cultivation, of turned soil, and of water that has travelled from the mountains to the west. Torches have been lit in wall sconces against the advancing dark, and their flames shiver slightly in the air that moves across the villa's outer facade. You approach through a gateway where stone lions have weathered to anonymous shapes, their features softened by rain and by seasons that no longer register in human memory. The courtyard within is paved with brick laid in herringbone pattern, and your footsteps alter as you cross from earth to fired clay, the sound becoming flatter, more immediate, announcing your presence to whoever might listen from the rooms that face inward on this space. Oil lamp smoke, bitter, mixes with lavender and rosemary from garden borders, where the day's heat has concentrated the essential oils in leaf and stem, and this compound fragrance drifts through archways, through unglazed windows, into chambers where manuscripts wait on reading desks, and where conversation has already begun in low voices that carry no urgency, only the pleasure of sustained attention to questions that resist final answers. Marsilio Ficino arrives from his nearby house, carrying manuscript pages still damp from copying, and you observe him as he crosses the courtyard with the slight stoop of one who has spent the hours of daylight bent over texts, his fingers stained with the Iengall ink that dries to a brown-black on the prepared surface of vellum. He was a humanist, philosopher, translator, and physician, this man who moves toward the lighted rooms with the unhurried pace of someone who has learned that haste serves no purpose in the pursuit of understanding, and you notice how he pauses at the entrance to brush a moth from the page he carries, how he shields the still damp lines with the curve of his body, as he steps from the cooler air of evening into the warmth and light within. The villa at Careggi was a Medici country residence where philosophical discussions occurred, and tonight will be one more occasion in a sequence that stretches back through years of patronage and forward into decades that Ficino will not live to see completed. Cosimo, aging now, requests a reading from the Symposium, the Greek text rendered in Ficino's Latin, and you find your place among the gathering in a chamber where the ceiling has been painted with constellations that imitate the night sky you will see later if you walk out into the gardens. There was no formal Platonic academy. The name is a later invention, and what assembles here is only what has assembled before, an informal circle of students which Ficino called academici, close to the Medici household, drawn together by invitation, and by shared fascination with Plato's dialogues rather than by any institutional framework that would require enrollment or record or the formal obligations of a studium. The absence of such structure is itself felt as a freedom, as a space in which thought might move without the constraints that ecclesiastical or civic authority would impose upon more established gatherings. Young scholars gather and you observe them as they find their seats on benches and on cushions, as they arrange their own notes and their own tablets, as they settle into postures of attention that will be sustained for hours. The weight of codex pages, calfskin binding soft with age and handling, passes from hand to hand as texts are consulted in anticipation of the reading. And you feel this weight yourself when a volume is offered to you, the boards yielding slightly under your fingers, the skin of the spine polished to a surface that seems almost luminous in the lamplight. Ficino's translations were completed in the 60s and 70s of this century, the Greek rendered into Latin with a precision that sought to preserve not only the arguments, but the cadences of the original, and the pages you hold bear the marks of this labor. The annotations in margins where Ficino has clarified a term or offered a cross-reference to the Neoplatonists whose interpretations would become decisive for early modern thought. The scratch of reed pen on vellum, Ficino's cursive Latin flowing left to right, is a sound that you have heard before in other rooms, in other hours, and now you hear it again as he makes a final correction to the manuscript he carries, as he prepares to read aloud from the translation that Cosimo de' Medici commissioned. Cosimo had been driven by a conviction that the wisdom of antiquity held keys to the present confusion of human affairs, and Ficino's work at Careggi continued under Lorenzo de' Medici's patronage after the old man's death. The same rooms, the same gardens, the same slow rhythm of reading and response and walking meditation that you will participate in tonight. The evening cool rises from the Arno Valley below Careggi, and the chamber in which you sit seems to breathe with this coolness, the warmth of bodies and lamps insufficient to overcome the natural descent of air from higher altitudes, the equilibrium that will be restored as the night progresses, and the earth releases its stored heat into the darkness above. Ficino begins to read, and his voice carries the Latin with an ease that speaks of long practice, of years in which the languages of antiquity have become as familiar as the vernacular he spoke as a child. The symposium unfolds in his rendering, the speeches on love succeeding one another with the inevitability of ritual, Alcibiades arriving drunk and magnificent at the close, Socrates emerging as always the one who cannot be defeated because he has already defeated himself, has already made his poverty into his strength. Night insects begin in the cypresses, a constant whisper under philosophical speech, and this whisper becomes part of the texture of listening, the auditory equivalent of the lamplight that flickers across the faces turned toward Ficino, that makes shadows move and stillness on the ceiling where painted stars offer a permanent, idealized version of the actual heavens. You find yourself following the Greek in your own copy, the Latin in Ficino's voice moving parallel to the words your eyes trace, and the double attention produces a kind of trance, a suspension of ordinary awareness in which the arguments seem to arrive from a great distance, to be received rather than constructed by the labor of understanding. Ficino translated Plato and Plotinus into Latin, making them accessible to Western readers who had known these texts only in fragmentary quotation or in the distortions of medieval compendia. And you are among the beneficiaries of this labor, among the first generation for whom the complete dialogues lie open to study in a language that requires no special initiation beyond the ordinary training of an educated person. His influence extended across Europe, reaching figures like Pico della Mirandola, and even now, even here in this room at Careggi, you can feel the outward ripple of what is being spoken, the way these sentences will be carried in memory to other rooms, other cities, other centuries where they will seed new thought in minds that have not yet taken form. The reading pauses, and in the silence that follows, you become aware of distant bells from Florence, carried on still air, marking canonical hours that the participants in this gathering have largely ceased to observe in their formal religious sense, though the habit of attention to such markers persists in the body even when the mind has moved to other measures of time. The oil lamp smoke, bitter, continues to rise toward the painted constellations, and someone moves to trim a wick that has grown too long, to restore the steady flame that permits reading to continue without strain. Ficino's interpretation of Plato through Neoplatonism became decisive for early modern thought, and you sense this decisiveness not as a weight of doctrine, but as an opening, a clearing in the forest of received opinion where new paths might be discovered, where the soul's ascent to the One might be contemplated with the same seriousness that earlier generations had reserved for the drama of salvation, rendered in more familiar terms. A guest has begun to shiver, and the conversation turns to practical matters as Ficino pauses to treat the fever with his medical knowledge, philosophy and physic intertwined in a single understanding of the human person as microcosm, as reflection of universal harmonies that might be restored through the proper application of substance and regimen. You watch as he examines the man's pulse, as he prescribes a cooling draught compounded from the garden's simples, as he speaks of the body's humours with the same precision he brings to the analysis of the soul's faculties in Plato's psychology. The garden at Careggi, where walking discussions continue in summer months, lies beyond the chamber where this medical consultation occurs, and you anticipate the moment when the fevered guest will be settled to rest, and the company will move outward into the darkness where stars offer their own text, their own dialogue between the visible and the intelligible. The manuscript collection grows, each text carried by couriers from Greek monasteries or Latin monasteries north of the Alps, and you have seen these couriers arrive at the villa's gate, dusty from the road, bearing their precious cargoes in wrappings of oiled leather against the weather that might otherwise damage what centuries have preserved. Ficino also translated works of Hermes Trismegistus, believed to be an ancient Egyptian sage, and these texts too have arrived by similar channels, their Greek versions prepared in Byzantine scriptoria, their claims to primordial wisdom offering a parallel genealogy of thought that Ficino found congenial to his synthesizing temperament. The translations were completed in the 1460s and 1470s, a labor of decades that has left its mark in the scholar's stooped shoulders, in the ink-stained fingers that now rest on the manuscript of the symposium, as he awaits the return of philosophical composure after the interruption of medical care. The fevered guest has been settled in an upper room, and the company disperses into smaller groups, some remaining to continue the discussion of love's nature with the text open before them, others moving toward the garden where the night air offers refreshment after the accumulated warmth of bodies and lamps. You follow this latter path, stepping from the threshold onto gravel that shifts and crunches under your weight, the sound immediately absorbed by the darkness that surrounds the villa's illuminated windows. The garden is quieter now than in summer months, the cicadas silent, the night insects beginning in the cypresses with a persistence that will continue until dawn, a constant whisper under philosophical speech that continues as you pass groups of 2 and 3 who have found their own paths through the terrace plantings, their voices low, their gestures occasional and restrained in the manner of those who have learned that understanding moves best in subdued registers. You move toward the garden's edge, where a balustrade offers a prospect of Florence, diminished now to a constellation of its own. The towers and palaces become sources of light, without distinguishable form, the river a darkness between these points of human persistence. Marsilio Ficino has stood in this same place, has felt this same coolness rising, has contemplated the same dissolution of the particular into the general pattern that the night enforces upon vision. He died 1st October 1499 in Careggi, then a village outside Florence, and though this event lies decades in the future from the evening you inhabit, you feel its shadow as a kind of completion, as the necessary terminus of a life that has been dedicated to the recovery of what time threatens to obscure. Night insects continue in the cypresses, and somewhere beyond the gardens, formal limits an owl calls with the resonant hollowness that seems to belong to no particular source, to emanate instead from the darkness itself as one of its inherent properties. Distant bells from Florence mark another hour, and you count the strokes without the urgency that would attend a need to measure remaining time, counting instead as one might count breaths in a meditation, as a way of remaining present to the moment's fullness without demanding that it yield to subsequent moments. Vicino's work at Careggi continued under Lorenzo de Medici's patronage, and you know that the young Lorenzo will himself walk these paths, will himself sit in the chamber where the symposium was read tonight, will carry forward the family commitment to philosophical study that Cosimo inaugurated in his own later years. This absence of institutional framework means that continuation depends upon the lives of those who compose it, upon Vicino's survival, upon Lorenzo's continued interest, upon the accidents of political fortune that will determine whether Florence remains hospitable to such gatherings, or whether the pressures of conflict and exile will disperse what has been assembled with such patience. You return to the villa's interior, and the warmth of the lamps encloses you after the garden's coolness, the transition producing a shiver that passes through your shoulders and is gone. The scratch of reed pen on vellum reaches you from an adjacent chamber where the scholar has returned to his copying despite the hour, despite the fatigue that must accumulate in eyes and hand and back. Oil lamp smoke, bitter, mingles with the residual scent of the evening's gathering. The lavender and rosemary from garden borders, now less distinct, overlaid with the sharper smell of ink and of the pumice stone used to prepare the vellum's surface for receiving new text. You imagine couriers even now upon their roads, even now approaching or receding from the villa at Careggi with their precious burdens, participants in a network of exchange that connects this Tuscan hillside to the dispersed repositories of ancient learning. You observe him now as he works, his face composed in the concentration that excludes the immediate environment, that attends only to the passage from Greek meaning to Latin expression, from one alphabet to another, from one philosophical tradition to its transformation in a new linguistic medium. The multiplicity of his designations is visible in the instruments that surround him, the medical simples among his papers, the astronomical diagrams that assist in determining propitious moments, the correspondence from scholars across Europe that awaits his attention when the copying is done. A servant enters to close a shutter against the evening cool, to preserve the warmth that permits the ink to flow, the hand to move with precision across the prepared surface. You withdraw from this observation, not wanting to disturb what disturbance would diminish, and find your way to the chamber prepared for guests, where a bed has been made with linens that carry the faint scent of the lavender in which they were stored. The volume you held earlier still presents itself to your fingers as a kind of phantom sensation, a reminder of the substance that carries thought from mind to mind across the intervals of space and time. Night insects continue in the cypresses, and this sound persists through the window that has been left open above the garden, a whisper that will accompany your descent into sleep, that will still be sounding when consciousness releases its hold upon the particular and permits the general darkness to enclose what has been experienced in this day at Careggi. You anticipate, in the drifting that precedes sleep, the conversations that will occur in future years between scholars who have never met Vicino, but who have received his translations, his interpretations, his vision of philosophy as a way of life, rather than merely a discipline of argument. These discussions continue in some sense even now, even in your solitude, even in the darkness that has settled upon the Arno Valley and upon the hills that frame it, the darkness that makes visible the stars that Ficino studied, that he translated into his philosophical vocabulary as emblems of the soul's origin and destination. Distant bells from Florence mark another hour, and you do not count them now, do not attend to their number, receiving them only as sound, as vibration in the darkness, as one more texture of the world that persists without your attention and that will persist when attention has ceased entirely. Marsilio Ficino has completed his copying for the night, has extinguished his lamp, has made his way through the familiar darkness to his own rest. The oil lamp smoke, bitter, lingers in the chambers where thought has moved across the hours, mixing now with the deeper coolness of full night, with the moisture that descends from the higher air to settle upon the garden's herbs, upon the gravel paths, upon the stones of the courtyard where tomorrow's footsteps will announce new arrivals, new readings, new passages of the philosophical journey that has no final destination, but only the continual approach, the asymptotic drawing near, to what remains always beyond complete attainment. You sleep now in the villa at Careggi, and the darkness receives you as it receives all who surrender to its necessity, the darkness that was before these walls were built, that will persist when they have become again the earth from which they were raised. You are part of this coolness now, part of the night's equilibrium, the exchange between warmth and cold that constitutes the atmosphere in which mortal life persists. Night insects continue in the cypresses, a constant whisper under philosophical speech that has fallen silent, under the breathing of sleepers in their various chambers, under the stars that move in their ancient patterns toward the dawn that will come without urgency, that will arrive as all things arrive in this place, where patience has been learned from the study of texts that have survived their authors, that speak still in voices not their own, that wait for readers who will receive them in the darkness of a future that cannot be imagined, but that will be, that must be, that is already implicit in the turning of the earth and the persistence of desire. The Via dei Servi lies quiet beneath a sky that has not yet decided to lighten, though somewhere beyond the eastern hills the sun has already begun its slow approach. You are standing where the street narrows between tall buildings of Pietraforte, the golden-brown limestone that seems to absorb what little light exists and return it softened, warmed, made human. Around you, shutters begin to lift on workshop windows, each aperture releasing a shaft of candlelight or lamplight onto the damp cobblestones below. The Art dei Medici e Speciali has not yet opened its guild offices for the day, but the painters and sculptors who share its jurisdiction with doctors and spice merchants have long since risen. Their Botteghe are already lit from within, the masters and senior apprentices having stirred the night's banked fires into new life, having set water to heat for the morning's first preparations. You breathe air that carries the mingled scents of walnut oil, of yesterday's pigments still settling in the rushes, of bread from a baker's oven 2 streets away. The rhythmic scrape of pestle against stone slab comes through an open window somewhere ahead, someone already grinding, already transforming raw earth into the possibility of color. A young apprentice has been awake since the 4th hour, moving through the darkness of Verrocchio's workshop with the confidence of one who has memorized every obstacle in the blackness. Perhaps this is Leonardo, perhaps another boy of 14 or 15 years, the records of 1466 not being precise about which mornings belong to which hands. Whoever he may be, he sits now at a low bench with mortar and pestle of heavy stone, working cinnabar into a finer and finer powder. The red dust rises with each circular motion, settles upon his fingers, stains the walls of his fingerprints in a color that will not wash away with mere water. He has been told to grind until the pigment passes through silk without catching, until the particles are so fine they float upon the air like breath. This is the first skill of the Botteghe, more fundamental than drawing, more essential than understanding perspective, the transformation of matter through patience. The boy does not hurry. His contract binds him for years to come, 3 at minimum, perhaps 10 if the master finds him worthy of the full training. There is time. There is always time in the Botteghe, though deadlines press and patrons wait, for the pigment itself cannot be rushed. Verrocchio moves through the inner room where the wax models stand upon shelves like pale, unfinished souls. He has lit additional tapers, though dawn now sends its first pale suggestion through the high windows. The hot wax smell from the modelling room drifts through the doorway, sulphur and beeswax mingled in a sweetness that carries always the memory of its source. The hive, the flame, the chemical transformation. The master holds a small tool whose tip he has warmed in a candle flame, and with this he approaches a figure of perhaps 2 feet in height, a draped form that will someday be translated into bronze if the patron's contract is fulfilled, if the foundry cooperates, if the mold holds true. He adjusts drapery folds with the heated instrument, the wax yielding beneath his touch like flesh, like memory, like something that wishes to be other than it is. The workshop system has taught him that nothing is made alone, that even the master's hand is extended by assistants who prepare the clay armatures, who mix the wax with its additives, who tend the fires that make transformation possible. Yet in this moment, in the grey light that strengthens now, he works alone upon the folds, seeking a particular fall of fabric that he has seen in his mind since waking in darkness. The courtyard behind the main workshop holds the furnace that dominates the Botteghe's more industrial operations. A senior apprentice, perhaps in his 6th or 7th year, has been building the fire since before dawn, layering charcoal upon charcoal, working the bellows with a rhythm that has become meditative through repetition. The furnace roars to life as the bellows find their pace, and the bronze ingots begin their long surrender to heat. They will melt for the day's pour, these lumps of alloyed copper and tin, these materials that have travelled from foundries and mines to arrive at this moment of liquid transformation. The temperature must reach 1200 degrees, a threshold that means nothing to the men who judge by colour and by instinct, who know the moment when the metal glows orange-white and seems to generate its own light from within. The heat blast when the furnace door opens will be sudden, shocking even to those who have felt it 100 times before. For now, the apprentice works the bellows, and the sound fills the courtyard, and the pigeons that have nested in the eaves have long since fled to cooler perches. You move through the spaces of the Botteghe as the morning progresses, and the particular silence of concentrated manual labour settles over every room. This silence is broken only by tool sounds, the scrape of metal on stone, the soft tap of mallet on chisel, the whisper of charcoal on prepared paper. Dust motes in light shafts from high windows catch the sun that has now fully risen, pigment particles suspended, golden in the light that has climbed finally above the surrounding rooftops. You stand in the room where panels are prepared, where layers of gesso have been applied and sanded smooth, each stratum finer than the last until the surface resembles ivory, resembles skin, resembles something that waits only for colour to become complete. The apprentices who work here have moved beyond the grinding of pigments, or perhaps they rotate through all tasks in the manner of the Botteghe system, learning not merely one specialty, but the whole interconnected craft of making. The Florentine artists worked in Botteghe, workshop systems combining production and training, and this combination meant that every hand was trained to every necessity, that the workshop could not be separated from the school, that making and learning were the same activity viewed from different angles. A merchant from Venice has arrived with a package wrapped in oilcloth, and in the main room of the Botteghe, he unwraps his cargo upon a table that has seen 1,000 such deliveries. The lapis lazuli spills forth blue stones that have travelled from the mines of Afghanistan across the ancient trade routes, through the hands of middlemen and customs officials and sailors who do not know what they carry. These stones are worth more than gold by weight, and the pigment merchants from Venice who deliver them hold their knowledge close, understanding exactly which mines produce the finest colour, which shipments have been adulterated with cheaper stones, which batches will yield the most saturated ultramarine. The master examines them with a practiced eye, turning them to the light, scratching one against another to test the quality of the mineral. The Art dei Medici e Speciali would wish to know of this transaction, for the guild regulated painters, doctors, and spice merchants together in an association that made sense only to those who understood the shared materials of their trades, the ground minerals that became medicine and pigment alike, the imported spices that preserved and coloured and cured. The contract for this delivery will be recorded, the price negotiated, the stones set aside for the most important commissions. Other pigments lie in jars along the shelves, and you move among them now in the morning light that has fully claimed the workshop. Malachite from the copper mines yields its green, more stable than the organic colours that fade in sunlight, more reliable for the drapery of saints and the leaves of symbolic trees. Lead white, poisonous and essential, provides the base for all light, the foundation upon which other colours achieve their luminosity. Carbon black, collected from lamps or produced by burning bones, offers the depth of shadow, the definition of form, the presence of absence that painting requires. The boy who may be Leonardo, who entered Verrocchio's workshop as an apprentice around 1466, would have learned to recognize these materials by weight, by smell, by the sound they make when poured from one vessel to another. He has learned that malachite must be ground with water, that cinnabar prefers oil, that lead white demands the most careful handling of all. The Via dei Servi and surrounding streets concentrated goldsmiths, sculptors and painters, and the knowledge passed between these workshops, through apprentices who changed masters, through drawings that were copied and studied, through the sheer proximity of shared walls and shared problems. Verrocchio has left his wax model now, satisfied with the drapery, and moves to inspect the preparations for the day's bronze work. He produced paintings, sculpture, and decorative metalwork, and his reputation across these media made his Botteghe among the most prominent in mid-15th century Florence. The ceramic moulds stand ready in the casting pit, having been invested with their refractory materials over days of careful layering. The wax models within them will be lost in the process that bears their name, melted out to leave voids that the bronze will fill, precise negatives of all that the master has shaped. The furnace in the courtyard continues its roaring, and the ingots within have begun to glow with that particular orange-white that announces liquid state, that moment when metal becomes something else, something that flows and fills and captures every detail of its container. The master will supervise the pour himself, for this is not work to be delegated, this moment when months of preparation hang upon the correct angle of crucible, the correct speed of tilt, the correct reading of temperature that exists beyond numbers in the realm of experienced sight. You find yourself in the room where drawings are kept, the pattern books that serve as the workshop's visual memory. Here they lie in leather portfolios, in stacked sheets, in rolls that have been consulted so often their edges have darkened with handling. A young hand copies a drapery study, the fall of fabric over a bent knee, the master having corrected the previous attempt with lines of darker ink that show where the folds should deepen, where the shadows should gather. The workshop system blurred lines between master and assistant, with collaborative production common, and these drawings embody that blur, for no hand is purely individual here, no style untempered by the necessity of the whole. The boy works slowly, his own corrections visible in the lighter lines beneath the master's darker ones, learning through repetition what it means to see correctly, to translate 3 dimensions into 2, to make the flat surface breathe with implied form. Around him, other apprentices work at similar tasks, and the room holds the silence of their concentration, broken only by the scratch of metal point on prepared surface, the occasional whispered request for a different tool. The morning has advanced toward noon when a patron arrives, his entourage reduced to a single servant in the narrow street, his clothing speaking of the Medici circle without requiring the name itself. He has come to negotiate a Madonna and Child for a private chapel, a commission that will require the workshop's full attention for months to come. Verrocchio receives him in the room where finished works stand veiled against dust, where the light from the high windows falls evenly upon surfaces prepared for inspection. The contract specified materials, deadlines, and subject matter between patrons and workshops, and the discussion now moves through these specifications with the formality of long practice. The blue of the Virgin's mantle will be ultramarine. The patron agrees, understanding the cost, understanding that this color carries meaning beyond mere decoration, that its expense is itself a form of devotion. The panel will be of poplar, prepared with the requisite layers of gesso, sanded smooth, until it resembles something that has never grown in any forest. The deadline will be the feast of some saint, a date that seems distant now, but will approach with the inevitability of all promised time. You stand in the doorway as the negotiation continues, and the walnut oil thick on brushes in the adjacent room releases its rancid sweet scent, drying slowly in ceramic pots that have held the same preparation for generations of painters. The particular silence of concentrated manual labor has returned to the workshop's other rooms, for even the presence of a patron cannot stop the necessary work, the grinding and preparing and copying that fill every hour of daylight. Dust motes in light shafts from high windows continue their slow procession, pigment particles suspended, golden in the light that has climbed now toward its zenith. The rhythmic scrape of pestle against stone slab resumes somewhere, a new apprentice, or perhaps the same one, continuing the work that will never truly end. For every painting requires more pigment, every panel demands new preparation. Every day in the Botteghe begins again the cycle of transformation. The patron departs, his contract settled, his deposit left in the strongbox that the master keeps beneath the floorboards. Verrocchio returns to the courtyard where the furnace has reached its peak, where the bronze now waits in its crucible like something alive and impatient. The pour will happen soon, in the careful choreography that the master has performed dozens of times before, yet each performance carries its own risk, its own possibility of failure that makes attention essential. The hot wax smell from the modeling room has been replaced by the sharper scent of hot ceramic, of metal approaching its moment of change, of the charcoal that feeds the furnace's insatiable heat. The senior apprentice stands ready with the tools of his role, the long tongs, the protective leather, the knowledge of where to stand when the crucible tilts and the liquid bronze flows into its waiting channel. You move away from the courtyard, back through the rooms where the morning's work continues in its various forms. A panel receives its first thin layer of gesso, the brushstrokes visible only to the experienced eye, each direction calculated to cover the grain of the wood beneath. Another apprentice sorts brushes by size, and by the medium they have last held, the walnut oil thick on their ferrules, the rancid sweet memory of previous sessions clinging to their bristles. The drawings on their shelves wait for evening, for the master's inspection, for the corrections that will make them slightly better than they were, slightly closer to the standard that the Botteghe maintains across all its productions. This blur extends even to the quality of the work. for a painting might leave the Botteghe with Verrocchio's name upon it and contain passages by hands that will never be recorded, that learned their craft in the grinding of cinnabar and the sanding of gesso and the patient correction of drawings that were not quite right. The afternoon passes in the rhythm that the Botteghe has established over years, over decades, over the generations of masters who trained in their own youth and now train others. The furnace in the courtyard has been allowed to cool, the pour completed successfully or not, the moulds left to settle in their casting pit until tomorrow's excavation will reveal what the bronze has preserved. The Via dei Servi and surrounding streets have filled with the sounds of other workshops, other Botteghe, where similar processes unfold in similar rooms, where the Art dei Medici e Speciali extends its regulation over doctors mixing their medicines and spice merchants weighing their imports and painters preparing their colours from the same ground minerals. The guild has not visited today, its officers occupied elsewhere, but its presence is felt in the standards that are maintained, in the contracts that are honoured, in the shared understanding of what it means to practice a craft in the city of Florence. Evening comes gradually, the high windows losing their light in a slow dimming that seems to match the pace of the work itself. You stand in the main room where the apprentices have begun the clean-up that ends every day, brushes set in walnut oil to preserve their shape against the drying that would otherwise harden them useless. The rancid sweet scent rises from ceramic pots that have held this preparation since morning, since yesterday, since the beginning of the workshop's operation. The master's corrections have begun, Verrocchio moving among the day's drawings with his darker ink, making precise notations where the folds failed to fall correctly, where the proportions wandered from the classical ideal, where the hand of the apprentice revealed itself as not yet fully trained. These corrections will enter circulation, will be copied by other hands in other Botteghe, will become part of the shared visual language that the workshop system creates and maintains. The red remains, faintly, in the creases of his skin, a colour that will require several days of washing to fully depart. He has learned today, as he learns every day, the patience that the Botteghe demands, the transformation of matter through repetition, the slow accumulation of skill that will someday, perhaps, allow him to sign his own contracts with patrons, to supervise his own furnace, to correct the drawings of apprentices who have not yet learned what he is learning still. The apprenticeship contracts typically lasted 3 to 10 years, and he is somewhere in the span of that possibility, neither beginning nor end, merely present in the work that fills each day and makes it meaningful. The shutters begin to close on the workshop windows, each aperture releasing its last shaft of light onto the cobblestones that have dried from their morning dampness. You stand in the doorway as the darkness gathers in the Via dei Servi, the street quiet now, except for the sounds of other Botteghe, completing their own evenings, their own clean-ups, their own preparations for tomorrow's resumption. The rhythmic scrape of pestle against stone slab has ended, will begin again with the dawn, is already present in the expectation that sleeps in the muscles of the hand that holds the tool. The furnace in the courtyard has cooled to embers, the ceramic moulds wait in their pit. The wax model stands upon its shelf with its drapery folds perfected for the process that will destroy and preserve it. Verrocchio makes his final inspection, moves to lock the strongbox, to extinguish the last lamps, to leave the workshop in the darkness that it has earned through a day of light and labour, and the patient transformation of raw earth into the possibility of beauty. You breathe the evening air that carries now the coolness of the hills, the faint moisture of the river, the accumulated sense of a city where making has continued since before memory. The Botteghe, along the Via dei Servi settle into their night, their masters and apprentices dispersing to the rooms where they sleep, to the meals that sustain them, to the dreams that are themselves a form of pattern book, copied and reused across the workshops of sleep. This system continues in the darkness, in the knowledge that sleeps in the fingers of the boy who ground cinnabar, in the eye that judged the temperature of bronze, in the hand that corrected drawings with lines of darker ink. Tomorrow will begin again, as all days begin in the Botteghe, with the opening of shutters and the stirring of banked fires and the slow, unhurried transformation of matter into meaning, of raw earth into the colors that will outlast the hands that made them, that will speak still when the Botteghe is dust and the guild forgotten, and the city itself changed beyond recognition by the patience of centuries that grind as fine as any pigment, that pass through silk without catching, that float upon the air like breath in the last light of evening, in the first darkness of night, in the silence that comes when all making has paused, and only the possibility of tomorrow remains, golden in the memory of sun, suspended like dust motes in light shafts from high windows that will open again on workshops already lit from within. The bronze is waiting in the crucible at the foundry near the cathedral, and you are standing close enough to feel the heat that radiates outward before the metal itself moves, before the pour begins, before Lorenzo Ghiberti gives the signal that will send liquid fire into the waiting mold. The year is 1401, and Ghiberti, born around 1378 in Pelego, is barely more than a young man himself, though his hands already know the weight of gold and the patience required to shape bronze that will outlast the century. Around you, other competitors have gathered for the trial of skill that will determine who receives the commission for the north portal of the baptistry, the great doors that will face the cathedral square and receive the devotion of thousands. The cold air of the Florentine autumn moves across your face, carrying with it the scent of charcoal and the sharper smell of flux, the mineral powders that prepare the metal to flow smooth as water into every crevice of the carved wax. The light in the foundry is amber and uncertain, coming from furnace mouths and from torches set in iron brackets along the stone walls, and the smoke rises in slow columns toward the high roof where pigeons have settled among the rafters. You can hear the murmur of the jurors who have come to watch this casting, the priests and merchants and guild representatives who will decide whose panel of Abraham's sacrifice best serves the glory of the city and the faith. Ghiberti's competitor, the young Filippo Brunelleschi, works at the far end of the long room, his face lit from below by the glow of his own furnace, his movements precise and swift. The ring of steel chisels on marble drifts in from somewhere outside, high and clear, then the softer crumble of freed stone as another sculptor's assistant clears waste from a block meant for some saint's drapery. Dust motes float in the light shafts from high windows, suspended like breath in the last darkness before dawn, golden in the memory of sun that has not yet risen over the Arno. Ghiberti's panel will show Abraham with the knife raised, the ram caught in the thicket, the angel descending to stay the father's hand, and you can see how he has prepared the wax model with such delicacy that the folds of the patriarch's robe seem already to move in a wind that blows from the divine. The pour begins, and the wave of heat that precedes liquid metal washes over you, carrying the smell of hot clay and burning oil, the particular intensity of bronze at pouring temperature that makes the air itself seem to thicken and shimmer. Workers move with the practiced coordination of those who have done this 100 times, guiding the stream, watching for the moment when the mold is full, when the gates and vents will carry away the last bubbles of air. Ghiberti watches without speaking, his eyes reflecting the furnace light, and you remember that he is sculptor, goldsmith, and bronze founder, that these three arts live in his hands as in few others in the Italy of this century. The North Portal will take 21 years, from 1401 to 1422, and during those decades the workshop on the Via dei Servi will become a city within the city, a place where fire is constant, and the sound of metal never wholly ceases. You walk there now in the chapter's middle years, when the first doors are already hung and the second commission has been awarded, when Ghiberti at 40 is the most celebrated bronze worker in Florence, and the East Portal, the gates of paradise, has begun its 27-year journey from clay model to finished glory. The street is narrow, the buildings leaning toward each other across a strip of sky, and the workshops open directly onto the paving stones, where apprentices sweep the previous day's debris into piles of sawdust and wood shavings. Donatello, Donato di Niccolo di Betto Bardi, has his own space nearby, and the adjacent street's house workshops for both sculptors and painters, the air thick with the dust of creation, the green-brown of aged bronze oxidation catching afternoon light on brackets and finials set out for the inspection of passing merchants. Inside Ghiberti's workshop, the fire is banked to a steady glow that will not fail, the furnaces fed through the night so that the morning's pour may begin without the delay of bringing cold stone to working heat. Assistants move among the benches, chasing bronze surfaces with fine tools, their hands following the master's design into the smallest details of leaf and feather and curling hair. The abrasive powders for polishing bronze lie in leather pouches, the metallic tang on the tongue familiar to every worker who breathes the air of this room, who licks dry lips and tastes copper and tin, and the trace elements that give the metal its particular color. You stand at the edge of the activity, watching an older assistant hold a relief panel at the angle that best catches the lamplight, searching for the flaw that must be corrected before the piece can be approved for the door that faces the cathedral, the door that Ghiberti will work on until 1452, until he is an old man still perfecting the gates of paradise. The competition for commissions was fierce in this Florence, with public trials of skill common, and the memory of 1401 still shapes the ambitions of every young artist who dreams of escaping the anonymity of the workshop. Donatello worked in Florence contemporaneously, though his temperament led him toward different subjects, different materials, different patrons who would support the experiments that Ghiberti's public commissions could not always accommodate. You find him in the cathedral works yard, in the years before the bronze David, when he is still studying ancient fragments for his St. George, the marble figure that will stand in its niche at Orsa-Mitchell and seem to breathe with a life that Gothic sculpture had forgotten how to claim. The ring of steel chisels on marble sounds here too, high and clear, then the softer crumble of freed stone as his assistants clear the excess from the block, as Donatello himself leans close to examine the grain, the fault line, the place where the stone speaks of its own history and must be negotiated with rather than commanded. The fragments of antiquity lie on a rough table, a marble hand, a foot in a sandal, the draped corner of a toga that some Roman carver shaped 15 centuries before, and Donatello's fingers move over them with the tenderness of a physician feeling for a pulse, learning the anatomy of a tradition that had been broken and must now be mended. He worked in marble, bronze, and terracotta, and the knowledge gained in each medium informed the others, the clay teaching the flow of drapery that marble must seem to possess naturally, the bronze giving back the weight and presence that terracotta could only suggest. Sweat cools on workers' backs as furnaces are banked for the night, and the green-brown of aged bronze oxidation catching afternoon light marks the fragments of old fittings that have been gathered from ruins outside the walls, from the foundations of buildings being cleared for new construction, from the slow archaeology of a city that remembered its Roman grandeur even through the centuries of darkness. The David was cast in secret, its nudity controversial even in humanist circles, and you are present in the private courtyard of the Medici Palace when the bronze is first unveiled, When Cosimo de' Medici commissions this bronze David for the palace courtyard, a private classical revival that speaks of the family's learning and their deliberate cultivation of ancient virtue. The figure is small, almost a boy, and the sword he holds is disproportionately large, the trophy of a victory that seems to belong more to thought than to combat. The green-brown of aged bronze oxidation has not yet settled on this surface, which still gleams with the false youth of recent polishing, the abrasive powders leaving their metallic tang on the tongue of anyone who stands close enough to speak to the statue, to whisper the old name that Donatello has revived from the pages of Pliny and Vitruvius. But this is metaphor only, the commerce of art that moves through the Medici accounts, and the David stands alone on its pedestal, the first freestanding nude since antiquity, the body turned in contrapposto, the weight on one leg, the other relaxed, the hand that holds the sword's blade resting against the thigh in a gesture of such casual confidence that it seems to dismiss the giant's severed head at the feet as merely the necessary conclusion of an intellectual proposition. The cold air moves across your face, though the day is warm, the chill that comes from standing too long in the presence of something that has emerged from the earth's patience, from the crucible's transformation, from the sculptor's knowledge of what the body is when the soul has not yet finished with it. The Via dei Servi and adjacent streets housed workshops for both sculptors and painters, and the sound of making drifted between them, the chisel's answer to the brush, the furnace's breath against the grinding of pigments. Ghiberti's workshop employed numerous assistants for the portal reliefs, and the division of labor was precise, the master designing, the skilled workers translating, the apprentices preparing the ground that would receive the precious metal. You walk there again in the late afternoon of Ghiberti's life, when the east portal nears completion and each panel has become a demonstration of linear perspective. The mathematical space that Brunelleschi had first measured in the doorways of the cathedral now applied to the stories of Isaac and Joseph and Moses, the figures diminishing toward a vanishing point that exists not in the bronze, but in the mind of the observer who stands at the proper distance and lets the illusion complete itself. The foundry's final pour for the east portal is happening now, Ghiberti supervising at 70, his face lined with the decades of watching metal become what it was not, his hands still steady as he gestures for the workers to begin. You are close enough to feel the wave of heat that precedes liquid metal, to smell the bronze at pouring temperature, to see the green-brown of aged bronze oxidation catching afternoon light on the tools and fixtures that surround this last casting, the accumulated patina of a lifetime's work in this medium. The crucible tilts, the stream flows, the mold fills, and the silence that follows is not empty but full of the cooling that must happen now, the long patience of metal settling into its final form, the fire that must be controlled rather than released. Donatello's Magdalene penitent, carved in wood around 1455, shows extreme ascetic emaciation, and you see it in the church where it was installed, the figure towering in its niche, the body reduced to sinew and bone, the hair that has grown to cover the nakedness in the wilderness, the eyes that look through you toward a repentance that has no end. The sawdust and wood shavings from Donatello's wooden Magdalene still scent the air of the workshop where it was made, the grain of poplar revealed in the deep cuts that define the ribs, the hollow of the abdomen, the knees pressed together in the posture of one who has forgotten how to rest. He worked in marble, bronze, and terracotta, but this wood speaks differently, the material of the living tree accepting the message of death in life that the saint's legend requires, the transformation of desire into hunger, of hunger into prayer, of prayer into the silence that surrounds this figure now as it has surrounded it for 5 centuries. The cold air moves across your face in the church, though the season is summer and the pilgrims press close to receive the blessing of proximity, and the green-brown of aged bronze oxidation appears only in the candlesticks and grillework, for the Magdalene is pale wood darkened by time and smoke, by the fingers of the faithful who have touched her in their own extremity. Donatello worked in Florence contemporaneously with Ghiberti, though their paths diverged, the one toward the public glory of the baptistry doors, the other toward commissions that spoke in private languages to patrons who understood the reference, the illusion, the recovery of Roman forms that his equestrian monument to Gattame Larter in Padua would complete in 1453. Both artists received Medici patronage, though Ghiberti's major commissions were public, and the network of obligation and favor that bound the city together ran through these workshops, these courts, these moments of decision when a model was approved or rejected, when a foundry was chosen, when a life was assigned its visible form. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, though the harbour is Padua now, the square before the church of Sant'Antonio where the Gattame Larter stands, the general on his horse, the first equestrian monument of the Renaissance to revive the forms of Marcus Aurelius and the imagined grandeur of imperial Rome. The bronze was poured in a foundry near Venice, the metal shipped by water, the assembly requiring cranes and ropes and the coordination of dozens. The green-brown of aged bronze oxidation catching afternoon light has begun to settle on the surfaces, the horse's lifted hoof, the rider's calm gaze, the drapery that falls in folds learned from ancient fragments and now return to the world as if they had never been lost. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, though these are books and students now, the university town that gathered scholars from across Europe, and the statue presides over their passage with the patience of one who has already seen empires rise and diminish. The ring of steel chisels on marble sounds from a workshop nearby, high and clear, then the softer crumble of freed stone as another generation learns the trade that Donatello and Ghiberti transformed, the abrasive powders waiting in their leather pouches for the next commission, the metallic tang on the tongue of the next apprentice who will breathe this air and carry it into his lungs as part of the cost of mastery. The sawdust and wood shavings from Donatello's wooden Magdalene have long since scattered, the grain of poplar revealed in the carved saint, now protected by glass and by the reverence of centuries. But the memory of making persists in the streets where both men walked, in the Via dei Servi and adjacent streets that housed workshops for both sculptors and painters, in the competition for commissions that was fierce, with public trials of skill common, the democracy of talent that Florence claimed for itself, even as the Medici gathered the real power into their private accounts. Ghiberti died 1 December 1455 in Florence, and the year of his death is also the year of the Magdalene's carving, the crossing of two lives that had run parallel through the making of a city. You are present at neither ending, but in the workshops where both men worked, in the foundry where the bronze at pouring temperature still sends its wave of heat before the liquid metal flows, in the cathedral yard where fragments of antiquity wait for the hand that will understand them. The cold air moves across your face, and the light is the light of evening, the last glow that lingers after the sun has passed behind the hills, the dust motes suspended in the light shafts from high windows that will open again on workshops already lit from within, the fire constant, the assistants moving through their tasks, the masters gone but their presence in the tools they shaped, the methods they established, the doors they hung that still open and close on the devotion of centuries. The gates of paradise, Ghiberti's east portal, will outlast the building it adorns, will survive flood and war and the deliberate violence of those who could not bear its beauty, and the panels that demonstrate linear perspective will teach generations of artists to see space as the ancients had seen it, as a measurable quantity that recedes toward a point where all parallel lines converge, and the eye finds its rest. You stand before them in the museum where they have been installed, removed from their doors to preserve them from the air that would slowly consume what 500 years have not destroyed, and the green-brown of aged bronze oxidation is deeper now, richer, the color of time itself made visible in metal. The abrasive powders, the metallic tang, the sawdust and wood shavings, the grain of poplar revealed, these are memories only, the sensory vocabulary of a craft that has changed its methods while pursuing the same ends, the same transformation of raw material into meaning, of matter into the form that matter dreams of being. Lorenzo Ghiberti, born around 1378 in Pelego, died 1 December 1455 in Florence, sculptor, goldsmith and bronze founder, winner of the 1401 competition that defeated Brunelleschi among others, author of I Commentarii, among the first Italian treatises on art, maker of the North Portal that took 21 years and the East Portal, the Gates of Paradise that took 27. Donatello, Donato di Niccolo di Betto Bardi, who worked in marble, bronze and terracotta, who made the bronze David around the 1440s, the first freestanding nude since antiquity, whose equestrian monument to Gaetame Lata in Padua revived Roman forms in 1453, whose Magdalene penitent carved in wood around 1455 shows extreme ascetic emaciation. The Biblioteca Laurenziana and the Greek manuscripts you are standing in the scriptorium of a monastery in Constantinople, where the evening air carries the weight of 1,000 years of Greek thought, and a single scribe bends over a codex of Plato's dialogues, his iron-nibbed pen scratching faintly different from reed across calfskin that still holds the particular smoothness of well-tanned vellum. The ink made from oak galls catching the last amber light from a beeswax candle that gutters in the scriptorium drafts, smoke marking ceiling beams black in spirals that rise toward darkness. Around you, the city that was once called Byzantium prepares for siege, and the scribe knows, as you know standing there, that the walls which have stood since Constantine may not stand much longer, that the Ottoman cannons are being forged even now, that this manuscript he copies may be among the last to leave the city intact. He writes the name of Plato 3 times in the margin to steady his hand, and the words Cosimo de Medici appear in a letter pinned to the wall above his bench, a promise of purchase, a promise of preservation, a promise that these words will survive even if the city does not. The cold stone beneath your feet remembers older prayers than any now spoken in this room, for the monastery stands where Greek temples once rose, where Roman basilicas later gathered the faithful, where now Byzantine chant mingles with the scratch of pen on page and the distant percussion of cannon testing beyond the walls. You smell the must have aged vellum, opened after centuries in monastery chests, as the scribe unwraps his exemplar, a 9th-century codex whose pages turn with slight resistance, each opening releasing the breath of monks dead 500 years. The scribe's own breath clouds briefly in the January air, for the brazier holds only embers now, and the wood that might have fed it has been commandeered for the walls. His fingers, stained with oak gall and tallow, trace the marginalia of earlier scholars, the arguments in tiny Greek letters that spiral around the main text like ivy around a column, like smoke around a guttering flame, like time itself around the moment of copying. You're watching the harbour at Galata 6 months later, though for you no time has passed, for you stand where the story places you, where the manuscript now lies in a woven basket among 24 others, each wrapped in oiled cloth against the seawater that will nonetheless stain manuscript edges, the journey from Constantinople visible in damage that no amount of careful packing can prevent. The ship that carries these baskets is Venetian, captained by a man who cannot read the words he transports, but knows their value in ducats, in florins, in the gratitude of Cosimo de' Medici, whose agents in Constantinople have spent 3 years assembling this cargo. The wind that fills the sail carries the particular cold of the Bosphorus, where the Black Sea pours its darkness into the Mediterranean, where Europe meets Asia in waters that have carried Greek thought in both directions for millennia. You watch until the ship passes the point where Leander once swam to Hero, until the baskets of manuscripts become indistinguishable from the whitecaps, until the must of aged vellum is replaced by the brine of open sea. The transit takes the winter months, for storms in the Aegean drive the captain to shelter at Crete, then at Corfu, and the manuscript of Plato rests in a monastery cellar while lightning splits the olive groves above. When the ship finally enters the lagoon of Venice, the oiled cloth around the codex has begun to mildew at its edges, and the first act of the bookseller who receives it is to lay the pages open in March sunlight, to let the particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin drink the dry air of the Adriatic. You are standing in that courtyard, among the merchant houses where manuscripts arrive in baskets, by mule train from Venice, by ship from the East, where the trade in Greek thought has become as routine as the trade in spices from the Moluccas, in wool from England, in the amber and furs that flow down from the Baltic. The bookseller counts his commission in florins and writes to Florence that the shipment is ready, that the Plute collection, named for the benches that held chained books, will soon have new volumes to fill its growing shelves. Vespasiano da Stixi unwraps the parcel in the Via Larga Palace on an afternoon when the April rain has turned to mist, when the gardens of Cosimo de' Medici breathe with the particular green of Tuscany in bud. You are present in the room where the Medici librarian works, where the cold stone of the original palace has been softened by tapestries and by the accumulated warmth of 1,000 conversations about the nature of God, the nature of man, the nature of the state that might bring peace to Italy if only the right books could be found and read and understood. Vespasiano's fingers, as careful as any surgeon's, peel away the oiled cloth that has crossed the Mediterranean, that has survived the mildew of Corfu, that still carries in its weave the salt of seawater stains on manuscript edges. The ink made from oak galls appears unchanged across 6 months of darkness and motion, and the iron-nibbed pen scratching of the Constantinople scribe has dried to a brown so deep it might be blood, might be wine, might be the very color of thought itself preserved against time. You move through the palace corridors to the room where Cosimo waits, an old man now, though the systematic acquisition of manuscripts he began in the 1430s continues with the urgency of a project that has outlived its originator's expected years. The must of aged vellum fills this chamber too, for Cosimo has gathered not only Greek texts, but Latin, not only secular but sacred, not only the dialogues of Plato, but the church fathers who argued Plato into Christianity and Christianity into something that might survive the collapse of empire. Around you, the Medici agents acquired texts of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and church fathers from every corner of the known world, from monasteries in Germany where Carolingian copies slept in chests, from Spain where Arabic translators had preserved what Latin Europe forgot, from the declining Byzantine Empire, purchased or copied by agents in Constantinople who wrote letters that crossed the same seas as the manuscripts themselves, that carried the same risks of storm and piracy, and the simple failure of human memory to transmit what human hands had made. The Council of Florence, 1439 to 1445, gathers in the church of Santa Maria Novella, and you are standing in the corridor where Greek and Latin churchmen argue theology, but scholars exchange texts in the Latin of the university and the Greek of the homeland that some have not seen in decades. Johannes Bessarion walks these passages. The Greek cardinal whose black hat and red robes mark him as emissary of two worlds, who will later donate his collection to Venice, who carries in his memory the libraries of Constantinople before the decline accelerated, before the sale of manuscripts became the desperate commerce of a state selling its inheritance for survival. You feel the cold stone of Santa Maria Novella's cloister against your palm as Bessarion pauses to examine a codex offered by a Dominican, the particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin familiar to his fingers from scriptoria. He entered as a boy from the monastery of St. Basil on the Bosphorus, where he first learned to read the ancients in their own tongue. The beeswax candles guttering in the council chambers mark the ceiling with the same black spirals you saw in Constantinople, for the same faith burns here, the same arguments about the nature of the Holy Spirit that have divided Greek from Latin for 8 centuries. But in the corridors, where you follow the scholars, the exchange is gentler, more desperate, more aware that these manuscripts may be the last to cross from east to west, that the declining Byzantine Empire may soon have nothing left to sell. You smell the ink made from oak galls on the fingers of a young Greek priest who shows Bessarion a copy of Homer he has kept through war and plague and the slow impoverishment of his see. And Bessarion writes in his own hand a letter of introduction to Cosimo de' Medici, whose name the priest repeats as a charm against the future he can already see approaching. The manuscript you followed from Constantinople rests now in the Via Larga Palace, but its journey continues in others, for the Council of Florence, 1439 to 1445, has demonstrated what commerce might accomplish, and the Medici agents acquired texts of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and church fathers with renewed energy, with the certainty that time was shortening, that the fall of Constantinople in 1453 increased the flow of Greek scholars westward, but decreased the flow of manuscripts. For a city in ruins has less to sell than a city merely declining. You are standing in the harbour again, but it is the harbour of Livorno now, where a ship from the east has arrived with a cargo that includes not baskets of books, but human beings, scholars who carry their texts in memory, who will teach Greek in Florence, in Rome, in the universities of Europe that have forgotten how to pronounce the words that founded their civilization. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, enters this story as a young man of 20, already avid, already spending more than a year's income from a village on a single codex that outbids Venice for a complete Plato. You are in the auction room, though no such formal space exists, for the bidding happens by letter, by emissary, by whispered conversation in the loggia of the Medici Palace, where Lorenzo receives the agent who has spent 6 months in Constantinople, who has watched the same candlelight you watched, who has smelled the same must of aged vellum, who now presents his account and waits for Lorenzo's decision. The particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin passes beneath Lorenzo's fingers, and he does not hesitate, though his advisers murmur about the cost, about the villages whose taxes will not cover this purchase, about the political danger of a patron who spends on books what others spend on armies. The collection outgrows palace rooms, as you can see standing in the Via Larga in the 1470s, where manuscripts filled chambers that once held guests, where the Plute collection has multiplied beyond any Pluteus to contain, where the core of what would become the Biblioteca Medicia Laurenziana presses against the walls of the family residence with the same insistence that Greek thought once pressed against the boundaries of medieval Christianity. Plans begin for a permanent library at San Lorenzo, for a building adjacent to the Basilica of San Lorenzo that will house what the palace can no longer hold, that will declare to Florence and to Europe that the Medici collection is not private luxury, but public inheritance, not family vanity, but civic monument. You walk the proposed site in imagination, for the present building was designed by Michelangelo, begun 1524, after the main collecting period, and the ground where you stand still holds vegetable gardens, still smells of turned earth rather than the accumulated learning of centuries. The cold stone of San Lorenzo's cloister, where manuscripts were first stored before the library building, receives you on a morning when the autumn fog has not yet lifted, when the dome of Brunelleschi disappears above you and only the walls of the basilica remain visible, their proportions learned from the same Greek texts now sheltered within. Greek scribes in Florence produced copies for the market, some passing as ancient, and you watch one such scribe at work in a chamber opening from this cloister, his iron-nibbed pen scratching faintly different from reed across calfskin that he has aged with tea and smoke to resemble the must of aged vellum, opened after centuries in monastery chests. His deception is not malicious, or not entirely. The demand for Greek texts exceeds the supply of genuine antiquity, and the scholars who purchase his copies know, or choose not to know, that the particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin beneath their fingers has been manufactured in Florence rather than preserved from Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 increased the flow of Greek scholars westward, and you meet one such scholar in the cloister of San Lorenzo, a man whose name has been lost, but whose face retains the structure of Byzantine iconography, the same elongation, the same otherworldly gaze turned now toward the practical necessity of teaching grammar to Italian students who will never see the city he describes. He carries no manuscripts, for his library burned in the sack, for the seawater stains on manuscript edges, the journey from Constantinople visible in damage, became in his case not marks of survival, but marks of destruction, the books he owned sinking in the harbor as he fled in a Venetian galley. His memory, though, remains intact, and he recites Homer to students who weep at the beauty of words they cannot yet fully comprehend, who hear in his pronunciation a music that no Italian throat can replicate, that belongs to the Bosphorus, to the olive groves of Attica, to a world that no longer exists except in the keeping of those who escaped. John Lascaris arrives in the 1490s to catalogue and teach Greek, and you are present at his first lecture in the Via Larga Palace, where the collection has grown so vast that students sit on the stairs, crowd the doorways, press against the tapestries that Cosimo chose to soften the cold stone of his family's ambition. Lascaris is a Byzantine refugee in the most precise sense, a man who left Constantinople before the final catastrophe, but not before the decline became irreversible, who carries in his baggage not manuscripts, but the knowledge of manuscripts, the memory of where texts still lie hidden in monasteries of the Greek world, the contacts that will allow Lorenzo to continue acquiring even as the direct sources dry up. You watch him unwrap his own copy of Plato, not the codex that crossed by ship to Venice, then overland to Florence, 6 months in transit, but a copy made in his own hand during years of study in the Peloponnese, the ink made from oak galls still dark, the pages turning with slight resistance that speaks of his own presence in their making. The beeswax candles guttering in the lecture hall where Lascaris teaches have been placed in Michelangelo brackets, for even before the present building was designed by Michelangelo, begun 1524. After the main collecting period, the sculptor-architect has begun to influence Medici taste, to shape the spaces where thought will be housed. You feel the particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin in a volume that Lascaris passes among his students, a text of the Church Fathers that the Medici agents acquired to complement the encyclopedia of Greek learning that Cosimo imagined in the 1430s and that Lorenzo has brought nearer to realization. The Laurenziana holds the oldest complete codex of the Syriac Bible, and Lascaris has seen it, has touched its pages, has smelled the must of aged vellum that connects Syriac Christianity to Greek, Greek to Latin, Latin to the vernacular Italian in which his students take their notes, in which you might speak if speech were permitted in this dream. You are standing in the reading room that Michelangelo will design, though for you it already exists in potential, in the drawings that circulate among the Medici household, in the conversations where the library's reading room, designed by Michelangelo, features his architectural innovations that will transform the very concept of what a library should be. The staircase that descends to the entrance, the paired columns that seem to emerge from the walls themselves, the windows placed high to admit light without distraction, all exist in your presence as possibility, as the tomorrow that architecture always reaches toward. The cold stone of San Lorenzo's cloister has prepared you for this larger coldness, this more deliberate austerity that Michelangelo imposes, that makes the housing of books into a meditation on the weight of knowledge, on the seriousness of preservation, on the patience that outlasts the single life and enters the common memory. You follow Lascaris through the years of his service. Through the catalogues, he writes in a hand that combines Greek elegance with Latin abbreviation. Through the students he trains, who will themselves become agents of acquisition, spreading across Italy and beyond to recover what the declining Byzantine Empire has scattered. The Plute collection formed the core of what Lascaris organizes, but the core has grown beyond any simple naming, has become the Biblioteca Medici Laurenziana, founded by Cosimo and Lorenzo de Medici, a name that repeats through his catalogues as it repeats through your listening: Cosimo, Lorenzo, San Lorenzo. The library built adjacent to the Basilica of San Lorenzo, where the family tombs wait in the new sacristy that Michelangelo will also design, where the dead Medici lie in states of contemplation that mirror the postures of readers in the library above. The manuscript you first saw copied by candlelight in Constantinople has found its home here, among the Plute, among the benches that held chained books, its chain a modest one, its value recognized but not exaggerated, for the collection has grown to include rarities that surpass it, illuminations that glow with gold leaf, texts in scripts that Lascaris alone can decipher. Yet you return to it, standing in the reading room that Michelangelo designed, where the architectural innovations make the act of reading feel like participation in something larger than private pleasure. The particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin beneath your fingers is the same you felt in the scriptorium, the same the scribe felt as he copied, the same that has connected hands across centuries of transmission, of preservation, of the faith that words matter, that thought survives its thinkers, that the iron-nibbed pen, scratching faintly different from reed, continues even when the hand that holds it has returned to dust. Seawater stains on manuscript edges, the journey from Constantinople visible in damage, mark not only the Codex of Plato, but dozens of others, hundreds, the accumulated testimony of maritime commerce in its most elevated form, the trade in survival, in memory, in the possibility that what has been written need not be lost. You trace these stains with your eyes, with your attention, with the patience that the room demands, for Michelangelo's architecture teaches patience, teaches slowness, teaches the visitor to become a reader, the reader to become a keeper. the keeper to become part of the chain of transmission that extends backward to the scribe and forward to whatever future will find these pages still intact. The must of aged vellum, opened after centuries in monastery chests, has become the characteristic smell of this place, replacing the brine of arrival, replacing the smoke of the scriptorium, replacing even the particular cold of the Bosphorus with the temperate atmosphere of controlled preservation. Yet he does not discard the copies, does not expose the forgers, for the texts themselves remain valuable, the words unchanged by the date of their inscription, Plato's dialogues no less Plato for having been written in 1490 than in 900, the Church Fathers no less authoritative for the Florentine origin of their parchment. The collection outgrows palace rooms, and the collection outgrows even the first arrangements of the Laurenziana, and Lascaris lives to see new shelves erected, new plutae installed, new chains forged to hold what must be held. You are standing at the window of the reading room, looking down into the cloister where the cold stone of San Lorenzo's first manuscript storage still radiates the memory of its earlier function, where gardeners now tend the boxwood that Michelangelo did not design but did not remove, where the beeswax candles guttering in the offices below have been replaced by the clear light of Tuscan afternoon. The Biblioteca Medici Laurenziana was founded by Cosimo and Lorenzo de Medici, and you hear their names in the silence: Cosimo, Lorenzo, Cosimo, Lorenzo, the rhythm of patronage, of acquisition, of the systematic accumulation that began in the 1430s and continued through the decades when Florence itself seemed the capital of what mattered in European civilization. Many Greek texts came from the declining Byzantine Empire, purchased or copied by agents in Constantinople, and you remember the harbor, the ship, the 6 months of transit, the mule train from Venice, all the material circumstances that thought requires, all the weight that ideas must carry to survive their translation from mind to page to shelf to reading eye. The must have aged vellum greets you as the manuscript is brought from its press, for even chained books must sometimes be examined, must be proven real by the touch, the smell, the slight resistance of pages turning after centuries of rest. You do not read Syriac, but you recognize the script from Lascaris's descriptions, the pointed letters that carried Christianity eastward while Greek carried it west, the same faith in different forms, the same preservation in different hands. The manuscript has no seawater stains, for its journey was overland, through deserts and mountains, through the slower commerce of the Silk Road that brought other treasures to Florence, other witnesses to the multiplicity of human devotion. The present building was designed by Michelangelo, begun 1524, after the main collecting period, and you understand now what this means, that the architecture of the Laurenziana responds to a collection already formed, already shaped by the tastes and opportunities of Cosimo's and Lorenzo's lifetimes, already marked by the Council of Florence, 1439 to 1445, by the fall of Constantinople in 1453, by the arrival of John Lascaris in the 1490s to catalogue and teach Greek. Michelangelo walks through the reading room as you stand there, though he does not see you, sees only the proportions he has created, the light he has admitted, the cold stone that will outlast the particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin, the ink made from oak galls, the iron-nibbed pen scratching that has ceased entirely now, replaced by the silence of preservation, by the stillness of a room where thought has found its housing, where the tomorrow that Ghiberti and Donatello reached toward with hands that knew the weight of what they held continues in the keeping of pages that wait for the next reader, the next hand, the next life that will enter the common memory of those who stand where you stand now, in the presence of what they made, in the last light of evening, in the first darkness of night, in the silence. Light, he has admitted, the cold stone that will outlast the particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin. You are standing now at a harbour at dawn, though the water you see is not the Arno, but a memory of it, the light catching the same way on slow currents. Around you, merchants unload their cargoes of wool and alum, their voices low and unhurried, the syllables of Tuscan dialect rising and falling like the breathing of someone already half asleep. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the mineral scent of river mist and the faint sweetness of early morning bread from ovens somewhere beyond the warehouses. Lorenzo de' Medici was born on the first day of January in the year 1449 in the city of Florence, where the bells of San Giovanni had rung through a winter morning not unlike this one. Lorenzo, called Il Magnifico, would not remember that sound, being newborn, but the city would remember him. The Medici family had built their fortune upon banking, upon the counting of florins and the extension of credit across Europe, from London to Constantinople, from Bruges to Rome. Lorenzo's father, Piero, had managed this web of obligations and returns with a gouty patience, walking with difficulty between the family palace and the bank's headquarters on the Via Larga. Piero died in the year 1469, when Lorenzo was 20 years old, and the weight of the family and the weight of the bank and the weight of the unofficial rule of Florence passed to this young man with a long face and a taste for verse. You move through the streets now as the sun climbs higher, the shadows withdrawing from the pale stone of the buildings. The texture of the walls is rough beneath your fingertips, the pietra forte, the strong stone of Florence, cut and laid by hands centuries dead. A cart passes, its wheels making the particular sound of iron on compacted earth, the driver humming something tuneless and old. The light falls in rectangles across your path, warm now, the morning chill retreating to the deeper alleys. Somewhere a blacksmith strikes his anvil, the rhythm irregular, almost meditative, each blow separated by long pauses of heated preparation. Lorenzo assumed leadership after his father Piero's death in 1469, and those who expected weakness in youth found instead a mind already trained in the family's methods, already acquainted with the ledgers and the letters and the subtle art of making others feel themselves the authors of decisions Lorenzo had shaped. He was banker and politician from the Medici family, and he understood that these roles were not separate but braided together, the financial credit and the political credit, each supporting the other in a structure that appeared from the outside as the natural order of things. Lorenzo pursued a policy of balance among Italian states, maintaining peace through diplomacy, for he had read the ancients and knew that war consumed the very wealth it claimed to protect. He wrote to rulers in Milan and Venice, in Naples and Rome, proposing marriages and trade agreements and the mutual guarantee of borders, and for a time the Italian peninsula rested in an equilibrium that seemed, to those who lived within it, almost a permanent condition. The air in the afternoon has grown still, the heat settling into the stones which will release it slowly through the evening hours. You find yourself in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici, the arcades throwing shadows that pool like water around the central well. The sound of your own footsteps merges with the distant percussion of the city, the irregular heartbeat of commerce and craft. A cat sleeps on the warm rim of a fountain, its breathing visible in the slight rise and fall of its flanks. The water in the basin holds the sky in miniature, clouds drifting across its surface in a motion slowed by depth and stillness. The year 1478 arrived with the particular quality of springs in Florence, the light seeming to penetrate every corner of the city with an insistence that felt almost prophetic. Easter approached, the greatest feast of the Christian calendar, and the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore prepared its solemnities, the high altar dressed, the Duomo's vast space awaiting the congregations that would gather for the Mass of Resurrection. Lorenzo de Medici would attend this service, as was his family's custom, his brother Giuliano at his side, the younger man beautiful and popular, and less inclined to the careful calculations that governed Lorenzo's days. The Pazzi conspiracy of 26 April 1478 awaited them, a plot woven in the rooms of the Pazzi banking family with the knowledge, if not the explicit approval, of Pope Sixtus IV's nephew Girolamo Riario, who desired the removal of Medici influence from Florentine affairs. Francesco de Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini Baroncelli would carry the knives into the sacred space, an act that broke every law of sanctuary and hospitality and divine witness. You are standing now in the cathedral's sacristy corridor, the iron smell of blood still present in the pores of the stone, though decades have passed. The light enters through high windows in dusty shafts, moats suspended in the air like tiny worlds. The cold air moves across your face here, but it carries something else beneath its mineral quality, something that makes you aware of the throat's vulnerability, the thinness of skin over artery. The particular resonance of this space, the way sound dies quickly against the thick walls, suggests concealment and exposure simultaneously, a place where footsteps approach with too much warning or too little. Giuliano was killed in the Florence Cathedral during Easter Mass by Francesco de Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini Baroncelli, struck repeatedly as he fell beneath the altar's shadow, his blood joining the wine that had been consecrated moments before. Lorenzo was wounded but survived the attack, his own blood soaking the white linen of his Easter garments as he stumbled through passages he knew from childhood, through doors held open by servants whose loyalty had not been purchased by his enemies. The conspiracy involved Pope Sixtus IV's nephew Girolamo Riario and the Pazzi banking family, and its failure did not end the danger, but transformed it into something more open, more sustained, the papal interdict falling upon Florence, the armies of the papal states gathering at the borders. Lorenzo, 20 when he began, was 29 now, and the wound in his neck would heal slowly, would send its dull ache through his body in weather changes for the remaining years of his life, a barometer of pressure and approaching storms. The evening light comes through the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria with a horizontal quality that seems to pause before extinction. You are standing in the square below, the stones uneven beneath your feet, the air carrying the faint smoke of torches being prepared for the hours of darkness. The sound of a crowd gathers from somewhere inside the building, not violent but expectant, the massed breathing of witnesses. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of fear and anticipation, their faces turned toward the high windows where decisions are being executed. The cold air moves across your face with the first hints of night, the temperature dropping quickly now that the sun has touched the horizon. The revenge came with the efficiency that Lorenzo's city understood. The conspirators hanged from the Palazzo della Signoria, including the archbishop who had blessed the knives, before they entered the cathedral. The body of Francesco de Pazzi, already wounded by his own hand in a failed escape, swung with the others, and the Medici response demonstrated that sacred office provided no protection against the verdict of the state. The rope made its particular sound against the stone, the creak of weight taken suddenly, the silence that followed in which even the crowd seemed to hold its breath collectively before releasing it in a sound not quite cheer and not quite prayer. Lorenzo, called Il Magnifico, watched from a window, his own bandaged neck hidden beneath a high collar, and did not speak, for the lesson required no commentary, only the visible fact of consequence. Autumn mist in the Mugello hills, where Lorenzo hunts with falcons and writes verse, rises now around you as you move through a landscape of softened edges and muted sounds. The trees emerge from the grey only gradually, their leaves the particular yellow of late October, the colour of aged parchment, and of the gilding that Lorenzo's artists applied to sacred panels. The taste of Vanaxia at Careggi suppers, the wine chilled in the villa's deep well, seems almost present in the damp air, a ghost of fermentation and mineral clarity. Your boots make no sound on the wet ground, the moss absorbing each step into its green accumulation. A falcon cries somewhere above the mist, the sound descending through layers of obscured atmosphere to reach you delayed and altered, as if from another time entirely. Lorenzo was also a poet, writing in Tuscan dialect on pastoral, hunting, and philosophical themes, and the verses he composed in these hills moved with the same deliberate craft that governed his diplomatic letters. His poetry includes Canto di Bacco and Nencia da Barberino, among other works, and in them the god of wine appears not as debauchery, but as liberation from the weight of state, the shepherd's girl not as rustic simplicity, but as an alternative to the complex negotiations of power. Lorenzo continued Medici patronage of artists, including Botticelli and the young Michelangelo, understanding that the family's cultural prestige was itself a form of currency, more durable than the florins that passed through the bank's ledgers. The young Michelangelo lived in the household, carving a faun's head that Lorenzo praised, and the sculptor's rough hands held a talent that Lorenzo recognized as something beyond the ordinary competence of craftsmen, a gift that required not merely employment but protection, the space to become what it might be. The particular resonance of the Careggi courtyard, where verses were read aloud to small gatherings, surrounds you now as you stand in its center, the wellhead carved with Medici symbols, the arcades repeating their rhythm around you like the verses of a canzone. The light here is afternoon light, the sun having passed to the western side of the villa, the shadows long and blue with the particular color of Italian twilight. You hear voices from the upper rooms, the cadence of recitation, a pause, the murmur of appreciation, the silence of attention being given. The cold air moves across your face from the garden beyond the arcade, carrying the scent of box hedges and distant wood smoke. Lorenzo's diplomatic journey to Naples in 1479, risking capture to secure peace, took him through territories where his enemies held power, where the Pope's ally Ferdinand of Aragon might have seized him as hostage or worse. Lorenzo traveled not with the retinue of a prince, but with the urgency of a man gambling his person against the survival of his state, and the months in Naples brought him to the edge of illness and the center of negotiation, flattering and promising, and extracting from Ferdinand the recognition that Florence without Medici leadership would be Florence open to French or Milanese domination, neither of which served Aragonese interest. The agreement he reached held, and the peace he maintained through diplomacy extended across the following decade, the balance among Italian states preserved by his constant attention, his letters traveling faster than armies, his gifts of ancient gems and coins smoothing paths that swords would have blocked entirely. Night has fallen at Careggi, the stars visible in patches between drifting clouds. You move through corridors lit by single candles, the flame making shadows that leap and settle with each current of air. The night coughs from Lorenzo's rooms, the sound carrying through villa corridors, illness advancing, reach you from behind a closed door, a rhythm of damaged breath that speaks of winters accumulated in the lungs, of the gout that has already twisted his hands, of the slow betrayal by a body that has served ambition too intensely for too long. The sound of pages turning follows the cough, or perhaps precedes it, someone reading aloud or Lorenzo himself reviewing verses that will not be revised further, that have reached their final form in the knowledge that time for alteration has ended. Lorenzo collected ancient gems and coins, expanding the family's antiquities, and in these small objects he found the tangible presence of civilizations whose literature he had read since childhood. The cameo with its carved profile, the silver denarius with its worn emperor, connected him across centuries to collectors and connoisseurs whose names were themselves objects of scholarly recovery. He was banker and politician from the Medici family, yet this role of custodian gave him a pleasure that banking could not, the pleasure of preservation against time's attrition, of gathering what might otherwise scatter into oblivion. The ledgers of the Medici Bank declined significantly under his management, for Lorenzo's attention wandered to pursuits that returned no interest, and the branches in London and Bruges sent letters of concern that went unanswered or answered with promises that experience had already proven hollow. The morning at Careggi arrives with mist again, different from the Mugello mist, softer, more domestic, the garden visible only in fragments through the white obscurity. You stand at a window, the glass cool against your palm, the condensation of your breath leaving its brief mark. The sound of a lute being tuned comes from somewhere below, the musician adjusting intervals by ear, the same note struck repeatedly until it finds its place in the intended harmony. The cold air moves across your face from the opening you have made, carrying the particular scent of this place, the box and the cypress, and the distant manure of working fields. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of memory, the day's business already begun in rooms you will not enter. His son Giovanni became Pope Leo X in 1513, and another son, Giulio, became Pope Clement VII in 1523. Elevations that Lorenzo did not live to witness, but that his cultivation of church preferment had made possible, his loans to cardinals, and his management of benefices preparing the ground for these harvests. Lorenzo died 8 April 1492 in Careggi, the villa he had expanded and decorated, the rooms where he had read his verse to gathered poets, now holding only the diminished sound of his final breaths. The physicians had bled him and purged him and applied their learned ineffectiveness, and the gout that had confined him in his last years gave way to a more total failure, the body that had survived the Pazzi knives finally surrendering to accumulated damage. Lorenzo's death marked the effective end of the golden age he represented, though the artists he had sheltered continued their work, though the bank staggered on for decades, though the political arrangements he had constructed outlasted him briefly before collapsing into the Italian wars that would devastate the peninsula for a generation. You are standing there as the shadows of the arcade move across the paving stones, the sun's angle changing with the slow progression of hours that feels, in this place, almost suspended. A door closes somewhere in the villa, the sound precise and final, and the silence that follows holds everything that has been said in this space, every verse of Lorenzo's own composition, every response of his small audience of friends and poets, and the young Michelangelo, learning still the proportions of stone, the light admitted or excluded, the cold material that will outlast the particular smoothness of well-tanned calfskin, the ink made from oak galls, the iron-nibbed pen scratching that has ceased entirely now, replaced by the breathing of sleep. The morning air moves thin and cold across the stone of San Marco's cloister, where you have come to hear a new preacher speak. It is 1490, and the monastery garden holds only a few listeners, their breath visible, their feet shifting on the gravel paths. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican of Ferrara with hooded eyes and a voice that seems to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, has arrived in this city. You stand at the rear, near the well, where water reflects a narrow strip of sky between the colonnades. The cold air moves across your face. His words reach you not as comfort, but as accusation, each sentence weighted with certainty of judgment to come. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in streets beyond these walls, and the ordinary commerce of the city proceeds with its familiar rhythms of silk and grain and florins changing hands. Yet here, in this small space, something else gathers force, something that speaks of endings rather than exchanges. The light in the cloister falls in long rectangles, the winter sun too low to warm the pale faces turned toward the preacher. Savonarola stands before you with hands folded into his sleeves, his posture rigid as the cypresses beyond the wall. His voice carries no music, only the relentless architecture of argument built upon argument, each premise laid like a stone upon stone, until the structure of his warning towers over the garden. You notice the texture of his wool habit, coarse against the fine velvets of the few laymen who have come to test this new voice. The gravel crushes softly under shifting weight. Somewhere a door closes, wood against stone, and the sound seems to enter his sermon as illustration, as proof of the world's transitory slamming. The cold air moves across your face again, carrying now the faint scent of smoke from distant kitchens preparing the midday meal. Lorenzo de' Medici died on 8 April 1492 in the villa at Careggi, where he had sought the country air for failing lungs. The cold air moves across your face through windows opened briefly against the doctor's orders, against the press of flowers, against the very atmosphere of ending that fills the room. In the streets of Florence, the news moves slowly at first, then faster, the bells beginning their long announcement of what the city cannot yet comprehend. The Dominican comes, offers no comfort, prophesies doom. You watch from the corner as Savonarola enters this room of lilies and dying, his black habit seeming to absorb what little light passes through the curtains. His voice, that harsh, penetrating, unforgettable instrument, fills the space between the living and the departing with words that offer no anointing, only warning. The man who stands before the dying Lorenzo speaks of divine punishment for Florentine corruption, of the vanity of all earthly power, of the judgment that awaits even the most magnificent of collectors and poets and rulers of city-states. The smell of lilies in the death chamber, flowers masking the scent of decay, seems to thicken as he speaks, as if the flowers themselves strain to perform their office of concealment against this greater exposure. You feel the weight of books in the adjoining rooms, the manuscripts Lorenzo gathered, the Greek and Latin that will now pass to sons who do not possess their father's balance of iron and velvet. Pope Innocent VIII died in July 1492. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, and the news reaches Florence in the heat of summer when the Arno runs low, and the stone of the streets seems to breathe back the stored warmth of months. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of rumor, each packet of information more disturbing than the last. The corruption of Rome now not merely whispered, but proclaimed in the very election itself. The cold air moves across your face in the early hours before the cathedral opens, before the thousands will gather to hear what the Dominican makes of this latest evidence of the Church's worldly contamination. Savonarola predicted divine punishment for Florentine corruption, and now the corruption has a new name, a new face heavy with the Borgia features, a new target for the apocalyptic imagination that builds its city of God against the city of man. The autumn of 1494 arrives with French cannons at the gates, and Piero capitulates, the Medici name suddenly powerless. You stand upon the walls where the soldiers pace, where the flags of France move in the distance like a migration of strange birds, where the smoke of French campfires outside the walls, November 1494, foreign voices carrying on cold air, rises in columns that speak of an army's patience and its confidence. The cold air moves across your face with a new texture now, carrying syllables you cannot translate, the cadences of northern speech that have followed Charles VIII down through the mountain passes, and across the plains where Italian cities have learned to fear rather than welcome the foreigner. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of anxiety, the gates that should have closed remaining open, the negotiations that should have been firm dissolving before the young Pierrot's trembling certainty that resistance means destruction. Charles VIII reached Florence in November, and the city holds its breath between the first citing of standards and the final arrangement of terms. The Medici were expelled from Florence on 9 November 1494, and you watch from a window as the family flees, books from the palace library scattered, seized by mob or saved by servants, the precious volumes that Lorenzo accumulated now subject to the same disorder that attends all sudden transfers of power. The silence after Medici flight, palace doors sealed, no more music from courtyard evenings, settles over the city like a new weather, like fog that persists for days, for weeks, for the uncertain duration of a new order not yet established. The Republic was re-established, lasting until 1512, but in these first days of November 1494, there is only the hush of aftermath, the spaces where Medici presence had been now conspicuously empty. You walk through rooms where the tapestries have been stripped, where the bronze sculptures stand naked against walls that once held Lorenzo's collection of cameos and intaglios. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of speculation, each conversation assessing what this expulsion means for banking, for trade, for the intricate web of obligations that the Medici name had sustained across decades and across nations. The cold air moves across your face as you step into the street where a crowd has gathered before the sealed palace doors, their silence more eloquent than any shouting, their waiting more patient than any demand. Savonarola became the effective moral leader of the city after Medici expulsion, and his sermons now draw thousands in the cathedral, the same space where Giuliano died. The cold air moves across your face from the high windows, the draughts that Brunelleschi's dome admits, the engineering marvel that holds above you like a held breath, like the very suspension of disbelief that allows this preacher to claim the authority he claims. Savonarola's voice fills the vast space with a resonance that seems to come from the architecture itself, from the stones that have absorbed centuries of petition and now give back this new urgency, this apocalyptic messaging that attacks worldly churchmen and secular luxury with equal and undiscriminating ferocity. The cathedral holds more than it was built to hold, bodies pressed against the pillars, the fragrance of unwashed wool and winter garments rising to meet the incense that still burns at distant altars. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of repentance, the purses that once purchased luxuries, now contributing to the causes the preacher names, the transformation of Florence into a city of God, proceeding through the alchemy of guilt and hope. You watch from among the columns as faces turn upward, as tears mark cheeks that have not wept since childhood, as the harsh, penetrating, unforgettable voice finds its rhythm in the vast acoustics of the space. The light falls through the circular windows high in the drum of the dome, each beam catching dust motes in their slow procession, each illumination seeming to mark some soul's awakening to the preacher's terrible certainty. The Platonic Academy circle dispersed. Ficino died in 1499, and the conversations that had sustained Lorenzo's Florence now find no center, no patron who could hold the contradictions of philosophy and power in the same graceful grasp. The cold air moves across your face from a window left open by a departing student, some young man who will carry fragments of this learning to Rome, to Milan, elsewhere, the cultural world of Lorenzo's Florence fragmented, artists seeking patrons where patrons could still be found, seeking the secular commissions that Savonarola's Florence increasingly denies them. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of manuscripts, the books from dispersed libraries, finding their way to new owners who do not understand the conversations that produced them. The year 1497 arrives with the bonfire of the vanities, and you stand in the Piazza della Signoria where the pyramid rises, tier upon tier of collected beautiful things awaiting the flame. The smoke of perfume and paint and silk burning together, a sweet sickly column, rises before you as the children of the city, organized into processions, deposit their contributions to this purification. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of surrender, the masks and mirrors and cosmetic preparations that the new morality condemns, the lutes and songbooks that celebrated love in terms too worldly for Savonarola's ears. Botticelli allegedly throws his own paintings into the flames, and you search the crowd for his face, finding perhaps among the devotees some painter's hand, now raised in the same gesture of renunciation that destroys what it once created. The smoke drifts across the city for hours, for days in memory, the particular smell of destroyed beauty lingering in clothing and in the stone of buildings that face the square. The bonfire of the vanities has left its mark upon the sky, upon the lungs of those who breathed it, upon the conscience of a city that has chosen this path of visible renunciation. Savonarola was excommunicated in 1497 and executed in 1498, and the turn comes with the speed that power's decline always possesses. The same crowds that cheered the bonfires now gathering to witness the preacher's fall. You stand in the Piazza della Signoria on a May morning when the scaffold creaks. Then the roar of flames fills the air with a sound that echoes the bonfires he himself commanded, the execution proceeding with the same theatricality as his sermons, the same understanding of public space as moral theatre. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of relief, of satisfaction, of the complex emotions that attend the fall of the too certain, the too pure, the men who claim direct knowledge of divine will, and find that human power, once withdrawn, leaves them naked before their enemies. You watch from a distance that seems to expand even as you stand still, the figure upon the gibbet hanging for the prescribed interval before the fire reaches what the rope has already half destroyed. The Republic's experiment ending proceeds with him, the political arrangement that his moral authority sustained, now revealed as dependent upon a single life, a single voice, a single man's capacity to persuade others that he spoke for God. The cold air moves across your face with the smell of his burning, different from the perfumes of the vanities, more honest perhaps in its mere consumption of flesh, the body returning to elements without the mediation of symbol. The dome still stood, the baptistry doors still gleamed, but the political and cultural equilibrium was shattered, and you turn from the square knowing that what comes after will be neither Medici restoration nor Savonarolan purity, only the long uncertainty of a city that has exhausted its alternatives. The century that began with Cosimo's return ended with bonfires and foreign invasion, and you walk now through streets that bear the marks of both. The French presence withdrawn but not forgotten, the Spanish and German and Papal armies that will follow not yet arrived, but implicit in the weakness that the events of 1494 revealed. The cold air moves across your face with the quality of a new century approaching, the year 1500 visible on the horizon, the millennium's turning that will bring its own anxieties and its own false prophets, its own bonfires and its own scaffold creakings. You pause before the bronze doors that Ghiberti made, the gates of paradise that Lorenzo's grandfather commissioned, the gold still catching light that has changed its quality across the decades of their mounting. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of the ordinary, the grain and cloth and hardware that continue regardless of who rules, regardless of what sermons are preached, regardless of which books burn and which painters flee to safer patronage. The cold air moves across your face with a finality that is not despair, only recognition, the understanding that equilibrium once shattered is not easily restored, that the particular combination of wealth and wisdom and political skill that Lorenzo represented was not transferable to sons or to successors or to the harsh, penetrating, unforgettable voice that replaced them. The cold air moves across your face with the persistence of weather that knows nothing of human ambition, the dome still standing, the baptistry doors still gleaming, the city continuing in its stone, even as the particular equilibrium that made it luminous dissolves into the histories that will follow, the new arrangements of power and faith and art that the new century waits to disclose, the silence deepening now, the breathing slowing, the sleep approaching with the gentleness of a harbor, finally reached after long navigation.